So for some context, I'm a guy, and this happened when I was 18. I was planning on moving out of state for college, and I didn't want to pay the ridiculously high price for student housing. So me and my mom turned to Craigslist for better options. We found a lot of places near the school and for a reasonable price, but one we found would live in infamy for me. We found a place for $500 per month in an area near the school, so we instantly took it. On the day before my school's orientation, me and my parents drove down to the school and rented a hotel room for 2 nights. On the way down, I was texting the guy about the room, to which he gave a description as well as the address to where I would be going. I'd like to note that I was the one that was filtering through the options while my mom sent links for any new openings. After texting back and forth, he asked for me to send a pic of myself right after he sent a pic of himself. I sent him one, but by examining his pic, I began to feel a bit uneasy about it, especially after he failed to respond to any of my texts after the pic was sent, even the one where I asked him what would be a good time for me to check the place out. Later that night, I talked to my dad about it, and we decided to go to the address while my mom was asleep in the hotel. It was then that my suspicions proved to be true, as we were greeted with a trashy-looking trailer home with a white pickup truck parked next to it. Thankfully, it was like 2 in the morning, so he couldn't have seen us. The very next day after orientation, me and my dad explained our findings to Mom, where we decided that my enrollment at the school would be pushed back to the fall semester until I could find a proper place to stay. So from what I could guess, the guy must have thought I was an 18-year-old female looking for a place to move and that I would be checking out the place by myself. So when it was revealed that I was actually a fully grown man, he must have realized his plans to prey on a teenage girl weren't coming into fruition. Going into too much detail, my first year in college I stayed in a suite-style room. 2 of us in one room and 2 in the other, and we shared a bathroom outside of our doors. Long story short, by the end of the year the suite mates and I became great friends, and we alienated my roommate of the group. She ended up being a really hateful person. We decided that our second year we would try to get rooms together. We ended up only getting 2 of us in the same room, and the third person had a single. My roommate Cora was my roommate before. Now, Cora smoked a lot of weed. She couldn't go to any class without getting absolutely stoned. Now, I didn't have a problem with this, but I didn't smoke. Now, my roommate Sarah also smoked, but very little. Again, the first few weeks of our second year were great, and we had a lot of fun, and we all got along really well. That is, until Cora flipped the switch and changed completely. The first red light was when I asked her if she could cover herself when she got out of the shower. She would shower and stay completely naked and walk around the room, and I explained to her how it made me uncomfortable. She was fine with it. I didn't care if she wore a towel, but just not butt naked in the middle of the day in our tiny room. Next came the weird instances. Sarah came over quite often and slept on the floor between us, and we had a lot of laughs throughout the night. But there was one night when Sarah was awoken by someone reaching over to her very close, too close, and they were brushing her chest. She just froze and pretended she was asleep. She opened her eyes a little while later, and Cora was staring at her in the complete darkness. No phone, just staring wide awake. From here on, things just went crazy. She would scream at the top of her lungs in the shower and after because she couldn't walk around naked. She began to pluck every single pubic hair while laying in bed under her blankets, making herself bleed. She also started punching things repeatedly, and overall she made the environment extremely hostile. After a few weeks of this, I decided to spend most of my time in the study room down the hall that was only big enough for one person. Cora and Sarah were in the room, and I see Sarah run frantically down to the study room door and ask if she can come in. I waved her in, and she was in a state of complete panic. While I was in the study room, Cora had a complete breakdown. She threatened to hurt me and how she was waiting until I got back so she could strangle me. She was throwing things around the room and speaking horrible things about me and my family. Things that were so bad that Sarah wouldn't repeat them to me. She got to the point saying that she would hurt me in my sleep and strangle me while I'm studying. It was so bad that Sarah was frozen in fear. As soon as Cora left the room and decided to go eat, that's when Sarah ran to me and told me everything. Apparently, it got to the point that she actually had a pocket knife in her hand and was pacing back and forth waiting for my return. I ended up having to switch rooms, go to a safe room, and completely change my situation because she wanted to hurt me. Sarah and I are still great friends after we both transferred at the end of that year. She decided to see her about a month after I left the room, and Cora had carved the word happy into her arm and scarred herself on her upper shoulder. She repeatedly badmouthed the situation like we planned on ruining her life, when in reality it was all her. She's the one who went crazy. I really don't know what happened to her. There's a few more details that I left out, but overall this person became a complete nightmare almost overnight. Be sure to really get to know the person before you become roommates with them. You never really know who they'll turn out to be. Be careful. The story happened to me years ago, but it still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home with my family. I was up one late night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot, and I had the window open as I sat and folded my clothes. It was around 2 in the morning, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back out. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw a figure of a man. He was staring at me. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They didn't find anything, and they warned me and my parents to lock all of the windows and doors, and then they left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out her mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After about 20 minutes or so, she saw the man dressed in black slink into our backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to another tree and hid there, slowly working his way toward my window. My mother yelled something to him and he took off running. The police came back out again, but they found no trace of him. I never opened that window ever again, not even the curtains. My parents had installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited as this was our first place all on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city, and again, all on our own. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken, but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was pretty creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance near the lights, but often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time a flower was left, which I always threw on the ground, but once there was a pair of men's underwear left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy. This made me wonder if the person doing this knew me personally, and I started to become really suspicious and paranoid of everyone. There was a laundry area in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold them, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. I mean, they were completely just gone. Another week, I had a male friend over from school, and his tire got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He began to note things that proved he had been watching me very closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease, and I moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secured building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were wary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her. Another reason was that the new boyfriend Matt was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type you would typically expect to date someone like him. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend and had really felt like he was her Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side and he always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, leering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some kind of random fact that was completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created a dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There were only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from dating Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down immediately. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day I came home from work and I found Matt on my couch alone drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work and she told him he could just hang out until she got home. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. After about 30 minutes or so, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. Give him the benefit of the doubt, if you will. He put on a movie and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point I glanced over to Matt and he was just staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a, "What? What are you looking at?" at him, and he just continued smiling and said,
"I don't know. I just can't believe it."
"You can't believe what?" I asked. He then said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I then excused myself and then locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for anything other than sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there now, and he had even brought a bunch of his things into Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but I was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge bouquet of flowers on the table, and an already open card propped right next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. Without even reading the words he wrote, I was shaking. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I had kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was indeed the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on the way, I called Ashley and I asked her to come over immediately. She said she was at work, but said she would be there when she could. I was really freaked out to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state and she had never even met any of his friends. He said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. In the end, it was all lies. She was dating a stranger. We honestly don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left all of his things when he disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through all of his stuff. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments there was about 10 pictures of me. All of them were taken far away with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I know it had to have been at the current apartment before I started locking my bedroom door. A few of the pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us think that that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shuddered to think of what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, a few other random sick souvenirs. It was so creepy. Unfortunately, the police were never able to track him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I'd been considering, and I got the heck out of there as soon as I could. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I didn't know what his end game was. Would he have tried to hurt me, or was he just simply content with being involved in my world? I guess I'll never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. To this day, I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. If I had to guess, he's probably messing with some new woman now. But every time I visit my hometown, I am tense to keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again, but I really hope that never happens.
I just woke up in the middle of the night remembering this and needed to get it off my chest. When I was about 16, my father, brothers, and I lived in an old rundown house in the middle of nowhere. It was a private rental. My brother would do work for the landlord to pay our rent. Our landlord never came off as particularly creepy, but that could be because I rarely went outside when he came over to talk to my dad, and he wouldn't dare do anything in front of my father. I was home alone one day. My dad and brothers went out somewhere, I don't remember exactly where, and I had my dog in a fenced-in yard outside, but that was it. I was in my room doing whatever I was doing, probably playing The Sims 2, and we lived in the middle of nowhere, and there was a long driveway which the window of my bedroom directly faced. I couldn't see or hear anyone driving up the driveway. I saw a car, not my dad's, and kind of immediately freaked out. I ran and shut all the blinds in the house and turned off all the lights and checked the doors, making sure that they were locked. It was our landlord. He lived next door about 2 miles from our house, and yes, that was the closest house. This wasn't the first time that he'd come here unexpectedly. It happened twice before, and both times I was home alone. Those first 2 times he was only there for 10 minutes, walking around the outside of the house and then quickly leaving, but this time was different. I grabbed a big kitchen knife and hid under the kitchen table. I heard him pull up outside and open our front gate. My dog outside was going crazy and barking, and I heard him yell, and I could hear his footsteps walking up to the door. He tried to open the front door, and I was freaking out. At this point, I texted my dad, and he was coming straight home, but they'd be like an hour. He continued to walk around the outside of our house, trying to peek into each window. The house is old and has 3 doors that you can enter from the outside, and he tried to open all 3. I thought maybe that he didn't know that I was home. Maybe the last 2 times were just a coincidence, but he started saying things, including calling out my name. And he knew that I was home alone. I couldn't hear what else he was saying through the double brick walls, but I quietly creeped through the house following his voice up and down the hallway. I was trying to hear what he was saying, and that's when he said something that I'll never forget. "I'm gonna burn this house down, but I'll let you out first." Of course, I didn't take him seriously, which scares me even more. He wanted me to come out. He wanted me to take his threat seriously. And that's the part that gets me. I know exactly what would have happened if I had believed him, and my life would have been completely different. He was there for at least a half an hour, maybe closer to an hour, and he was very persistent, and he left before my dad came home. I told him everything, and we moved out soon after. I still don't know how he knew that I was home alone, and my dad never saw him on the way driving out, so he knew my dad was gone because there was no car in the driveway. But how did he know I wasn't with him? And why did he act like that? So this actually happened about 2 hours ago. I, a 26-year-old female, and my boyfriend, 36 years old, decided to go to the store to get oil. We had to drive 45 minutes to a European store located in a rough part of the city, but it's the only place that carries the exact foods I grew up with. My family and I are from Ukraine, but we now live in the US. It's challenging to find authentic stores that have exactly what we used to eat, and this is the only place I've found that even has the same brands. And as we're driving, we were on a 3-lane road and needed to get into one of those midsection U-turn lanes. We moved into our left turn lane, and suddenly, a black car sped from the far right lane, cutting through the middle lane and nearly hit us as it forced its way into our lane. My boyfriend and I were shocked, and then the car stopped at a green light meant for the U-turn. My boyfriend gently honked twice just in case they were distracted to let them know that it was their turn to go. They moved forward, and we turned into the parking lot directly to our right, heading to the store we needed. However, the car had just cut us off and then swerved across 2 more lanes and drove onto the sidewalk, entering the same parking lot and started tailgating us aggressively while laying on the horn. My boyfriend decided to drive a bit further into the lot rather than parking directly in front of the store. At that moment, I realized that his car camera, which usually records the front and back while driving, wasn't on. I tapped it, thinking that it would start recording, but it didn't. We realized that it had somehow disconnected from the car. As my boyfriend was trying to plug it back in, the black car pulled up next to us. I saw 3 young men, probably around 18 to 20 years old, inside. They were all African American, and the driver rolled down his window and started reaching for something, and I panicked, screaming at my boyfriend, "Just drive, go, go." He slammed on the gas, and we sped off with the black car still following us. My boyfriend suddenly started doing donuts in the parking lot, trying to shake off, while I was screaming, "Oh my God, call the police, I need to call the police." And I managed to dial 911 just as my boyfriend finished the last donut and began driving out of the lot. The black car continued chasing us until we got about 3 to 4 blocks away from a police station. The 911 operator asked where we were, and in my panic, I stuttered, trying to describe our location. My boyfriend, who used to drive for Uber and knows the streets well, shouted out the road as we were passing. The black car kept following us until they probably realized where we were headed and suddenly swerved off onto a random road. At some point, the call disconnected, but the officer called me right back and stayed on the line with us until we arrived at the station. We explained what happened, and the officer was kind, and he even offered to escort us back to the store in case those guys were still around. We showed him the skid marks in the lot, and he joked about them, and everything was all good. He did some paperwork while we were quickly grabbing the sunflower oil that I wanted, and my boyfriend tried some authentic Slavic ice cream for the first time, which he agreed was much better than American ice cream. We decided to cut our day short and thank that officer and went home. My boyfriend said that he was amazed at how quickly I made the right decisions and was surprised I even called the police because he knows I have a history of being assaulted by 2 on-duty officers 4 years ago, which has left me terrified of calling or speaking to the police. But in that moment, I was so scared of getting shot, and my only priority was to have the police there to keep my boyfriend safe if something happened to him. I was so terrified that my chest actually hurt, and I'm so happy that we're safe now. My boyfriend was now laughing, saying he can finally prove that front-wheel drive Dodge cars can do great donuts.
This terrible thing happened about 15 years ago. I was 20 years old and living alone. I came home from work, checked the post as I usually do, and found a sealed letter. It was a blank envelope. Inside there were 2 tickets to a concert and a letter. A love letter. The writer's feelings for me were quite clear. It went something like this. "Let's meet at the concert. I'll keep my identity hidden until we meet. I'm sure you'll be surprised. I'm someone you know." I had a boyfriend at the time, and I had no idea who wrote that. I thought for a moment that I won a competition or something. I remembered that I entered one. But then I remembered that I had entered that competition only this morning, so there's no way that the tickets could be in my letterbox by the evening. Something wasn't right, so I didn't go to the concert. I thought that if it truly is someone that I know, as soon as they reveal themselves to me, then I'd apologize, and I'm sure if they are a decent and kind person, they'd understand my caution. The day after the concert, I found a threatening-looking letter stuffed into my letterbox. "Why didn't you come? You idiot. Don't pretend like you aren't interested. This is BS. The first letter was gentlemanly in a sense, but this was the complete opposite. Back then, mobile phones weren't so common. As soon as I returned home from work, the moment I closed my front door, my home phone rang. I picked it up and the other party hung up. This happened often. I didn't get a call or letter every single day. It was irregular. I would get one a week, and then the next week I'd get 3 or 4. This kind of thing went on for about 3 months. It was so creepy that I ended up moving away. Finally, peace. Well, that's what I thought. Until 1 month after I moved into a new place, the same thing started again. I didn't get a call this time, but I found another blank envelope in my letterbox. There was no sender's address or name, so it must have been posted by hand. When I saw this, it was clear to me that I had a stalker, and the stalker had found my new home. I was really scared. I took the letter to the police station and spoke to an officer. Ignoring the other party is the most effective thing you can do. As soon as he realizes that he's being ignored, he will stop. This advice doesn't solve anything, I thought. Then the officer said, "Look, women who live alone often get lonely, right? And sometimes single ladies have a tendency to allow harmless antics to get blown out of proportion." He laughed and thought I was delusional. Back in those days, the word stalker wasn't widely recognized in Japan. The laws in place aren't what they are today. I felt so sad that he didn't try to help me. He didn't back me up. It was like he took the stalker's side. I'll just move again, I thought. But around that time, my boyfriend and I were talking about marriage, so I moved back to my parents' house while we talked it over. My parents' home was in the same prefecture, but it was way out into the sticks, so commuting to work was a real pain. But I thought, at least I'd be rid of the stalker. I was wrong. Carnage and bloodshed were right around the corner for me. I finished work and headed towards the train station. On the way, a man stood blocking my way. When I tried to go one way, he stood in that way, and when I tried to go the other, he blocked me again. He towered over me. He was peering down at me. His jaw hung open, and he was breathing through his mouth. It's him. It's my stalker, I thought. But I didn't recognize him. "Why didn't you come?" he muttered. For a moment, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about, and then suddenly I remembered. The tickets. I knew he wanted an answer, but I couldn't say a word. It was rush hour. People were all around us. I wasn't terrified, but I was scared. It was risky. So I said in quite a loud voice, for the benefit of those around, "Excuse me, please let me pass." As I said this, people all around looked in our direction. But then my stalker did something unexpected. He turned and ran into the busy street. Right before my eyes, he was hit by a car. You may think this is quite cold-hearted, but I just thought as I rode the train home, that is not my fault. I was kind of happy that the harassment might be all over. In case you're wondering, he lived. However, one of the stalker's colleagues saw this all unfold. This guy said that it looked as if we were having a lover's quarrel. And when the stalker got hit by the car, he said that I pretended not to notice, or feigned ignorance and just walked off. This rumor was spread around by the stalker's co-worker. Every year my company, and other companies in the same line of work, have a sports day for a bit of friendly competition. I remember talking to a few people, but there were so many people I can't remember who I spoke to very well. Apparently, this is how I met my stalker. I'm usually really good at remembering faces, but I didn't recognize him. I found out that he came to my company a few times a week. I work in the personnel department, hidden away in a small office, so I don't often see people, other than the ones I immediately work with. Yet the rumors about me grew. They said that we often met at work. Of course, I denied all these false allegations, and stated the fact that I was the victim of stalking. But I wasn't convinced that anyone believed me. Another shock was in store for me. I was dumped. Although my boyfriend and I weren't officially engaged, We had set up a date for me to be introduced to his parents in his hometown. At that point, we would officially announce our plans to engage. The rumors had reached their ears before I had arrived. As I said before, the suffering caused by stalkers wasn't well documented in Japan. They said to me when I met them, "You must have given this guy some sign that he had a chance with you. Somehow, you must have given him the wrong idea. You caused his actions. Are you sure there wasn't anything going on between you two?" With this doubt and distrust imposed upon me, my boyfriend was persuaded by his parents to end our relationship. I couldn't believe it. I wanted to escape. I wanted a fresh start, so I resigned from my job as well. It has been over 20 years since this has happened, and the wounds caused by the stalker still feel fresh. My desire to work hard at the assumption that I would eventually get married and spend my life with a husband has died. I came to the conclusion that I would end up alone. So far, I'm right.
This took place 10 years ago when I was 23 years old. For some context, I'm a male and live in the suburbs of a major city in the US. For the most part, the city was relatively peaceful and quiet. The crime rate was low and the people were friendly. I've made a few friends with the locals of my neighborhood and always saw this city as a place where I could be free. However, that all changed in just one evening. It was New Year's Eve of 2013, and I was sitting in my lawn chair getting ready to watch the fireworks my neighbors were doing. They went all out with fireworks every year, and why buy some when you could just see their show? So there I am, sitting in front of my driveway drinking a beer when I hear someone start screaming from down my street. Keep in mind, this was about 2 in the morning, so this was around the time where people had been sleeping. I then see a woman turn the corner, banging on doors while screaming her head off. She's blurting out these demands to let her in, that she needs help, and that he's, quote, chasing me. By the looks of it, she looked distressed and seemed as if she had just gotten out of a fight. At this point, the family across the street had already launched their fireworks and everyone was inside. I fold up my yard chair and go back inside to lock the front door, debating on whether or not to call the police. About 3 minutes later, the woman who had been screaming then came to my door and starts pounding on it. She explains that this, quote, guy is trying to chase her and that she demands to come in. Now, my house is located where I could see down my street, and when I did, I hadn't seen anybody out there other than her. I'm not one to deny help to someone in need, but there was something off about this woman. Something told me that the only person who was in danger was me. She's pleading for me to let her in, and I tell her that I couldn't, but that I could call the cops if she'd like me to. She disregards my offer and still insists on letting her in, only this time in a more demanding tone. I tell her no once again and to please leave my property. It was only when I said that where she then leaned in closer and said 5 words that have haunted me ever since. "You made the right decision." After she says that, her demeanor completely changed. She was no longer screaming and she no longer looked distressed. She just turned around and walked away into the night away from my house. I never saw that woman since that day, and I hope I never have to. Throughout my life, I've always thought that I lived in a nice city, but I guess I overestimated it. It's safe to say that scary things can in fact happen at night. Because scary things do happen at night, especially on New Year's. This just goes to show you that nothing good happens after dark.
This happened when I was younger. As an adult, it's even more scary. I lived in a town in Wyoming growing up. We lived in the front of the city park, if you can even call it a park, that is. There were a lot of people who were drunks, as well as homeless people that lived in the park, so most children didn't go to the park. Me and my brother did often though, as very little scared us, that is, until that night. Now, being a small town, even though living across a somewhat dangerous place, no one locked their doors. My room was the first one as you came into our house. One night I woke up to someone putting their arm around me. I thought it was my mom. Not that she did that, but I was only a kid. I turned over to ask what she wanted, and there was a homeless man who was in my bed and he was staring at me with a blank smile. He then said something to me like, "Well, looky here. Isn't this a real treat?" Or something like that. It's been so long, I'm not sure exactly what was said. I then screamed and he had said to quiet down since I was in his bed. My dad came into the room and then instantly got angry. Now, he's not a big guy, but he had picked him up and then dragged him right out of the house. The whole time, this guy was screaming that this is his house and that I'm now his wife. I was only about 10 years old at the time. We ended up calling the cops and they came and got him. They told us that it was our own fault for not locking the doors. Needless to say, after that, we always had the doors locked regardless if it was day or night. I moved away and into a safer place, but I do still lock my doors to this day. I'm even a little OCD about it, and I make sure that I can't even open the door. I'm a mother now myself, and I can't even imagine something like this happening to my own children. Any names mentioned in this story have been changed for privacy reasons. I want to start off by saying that I'm currently going into my senior year in college at a large university in Pennsylvania. This happened to me a few months ago while I was a junior in my spring semester. The apartment I was living in at the time had become flooded due to a burst pipe in my bathroom, so I was staying at my boyfriend John's house for a couple of weeks until the pipe was fixed. He lived in a house in a neighborhood that was only a 10-minute walk from campus, so it was really easy for me to get to and from my classes. The house was, well, interesting. It was a smaller 4-bedroom house that sat at the end of a cul-de-sac. A key detail to remember is that the house sat right next to a busy street with a sidewalk, as well as a guardrail separating the backyard of the house and the street. Another key detail is that the house had a creepy, unfinished basement with a side door that led into the basement, as well as a large crawl space in the back right corner of the room. The only person who went in the basement regularly is one of John's roommates, Owen. Now that I've explained all of the background details, I'll get into the main story. On the third day I'd been staying in the house, I was lying in bed in John's room when I'd got a call from him. When I picked up the phone, before I could even say hello, he then immediately said, "Jamie, I'm freaking out right now." I paused and I asked him what was going on, and he then responded by explaining that he was walking on the sidewalk down the busy street that I previously mentioned when a dirty-looking homeless man had approached him. John said the man was just standing in the middle of the sidewalk just staring at him until John went to walk past him and he started talking to him. The man was talking about how handsome John was, and that he must get a lot of attention from all the guys at school. John went on to explain that he had a girlfriend and had tried to walk away from the man. However, before letting John go, the man said that he lived only a few blocks away and that he would see him very soon. John then walked away quickly, and when he briefly turned around, he saw the man still staring at him with a wide smile on his face. I was freaking out because this had happened literally right next to the backyard of the house, but I figured that the man wouldn't know where John lived. He hung up on the phone and got home a few minutes later, but insisted that nothing would happen and that everything would be okay. However, several weird things happened over the next couple of days. I first saw that some of the food I had bought was missing from both the fridge and pantry. John had asked his roommates if they had taken the food, but both of them insisted that they hadn't. As well as this, I had heard weird noises at night that sounded like slow footsteps walking around the entire house, then descending into the basement. I just thought it was one of John's roommates sleepwalking and that John didn't seem to hear them, so I just shook it off. Well, about 5 days later after my boyfriend's phone call was when shit really hit the fan. It was the middle of the day, and John and I were laying in his bed watching TV when we had heard a loud scream from the basement. John jumped up and ran towards the basement while I stayed in the room scared as hell. A few seconds went by when I saw John sprint to his room and then yell at me to get out of the house. Owen followed soon after, so I knew whatever happened was serious. We all ran into the house and then jumped into John's car when he then told me what was going on. So apparently Owen was in the basement getting tools to work on his motorcycle when he had heard strange noises sounding like chewing coming from the crawl space. He didn't think anything of it until the noises got louder and louder, and when Owen went to look in the crawl space, he didn't see anything at first because it was so dark. So he had shined his flashlight into the crawl space and then immediately screamed. There was a dirty-looking man sitting in the far back corner of the crawl space eating a bag of chips. My chips from the kitchen pantry. That's when John went to go check out what happened, and Owen screamed at him to get the hell out of the house. John called the police while we all waited in the car with the doors locked. Luckily, the police arrived within 5 minutes, and Owen immediately directed them to the basement. A few minutes later, the police came out of the house with the man in handcuffs. John then gasped and then said, "Oh my God, that's him." I was confused until I then realized that it was the same creepy man who had spoke to John on the sidewalk only days prior. I will never forget the look on John's face. It was full of pure terror. After the officer put the man in their police car, they had took John's statement. That's when we found out how the man was able to get into the house. It turned out that he was homeless and had got into the house from the unlocked side door that led into the basement. He then crawled into the crawl space and set up camp there. When the police searched the crawl space, they found food wrappers, chip bags, bottled Gatorade, and a small blanket that Owen ended up claiming as his. He was the one stealing all of the food from the kitchen and was probably making the strange noises that I was hearing at night. It terrifies me to know that he was living in John's house for who knows how many days until he was caught. John has since moved out of that house, and I returned to my apartment. I never knew what happened to that man after the incident. For all I know, he could be back to roaming on that sidewalk, waiting for another house to break into. The moral of the story is to lock every door in your house and always keep an eye out for strange individuals. If that man wasn't caught, who knows what he could have done. This took place around 8 to 9 months ago on the 24th of August, which was a Saturday. School had been going on for about 2 weeks, so to distress a little, I had decided to see if my friends, who I'll call Griffin and Broly, wanted to hop on Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping, my dad was working, and I was bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got on to play because I had decided to make pizza rolls beforehand and ended up burning the batch. After a few rounds, I could tell my friends were getting tired of losing, so they got off after an hour. I was planning on just lying down with my phone and just going to bed. That was until I had heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not unusual for them to bark, given how people typically walk on the side of the road, but I still looked anyway just to make sure. I didn't see anybody, but seconds after looking out the window, I heard our garage door open and then shut. That usually means my dad is home from work, but I didn't see his van outside, and he had texted me earlier telling me that it would be working late. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room and then look out the window to get a better view. From there, I could see that our driveway was empty. There wasn't a person or vehicle in sight. At first, I just thought, oh crap, maybe it's a ghost, because someone had died on our land when it was a gas station before. Apparently, an old man put too much air in his tire and it just popped. I wasn't the type to go investigate, so I ran back to my bedroom and texted my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door, and she told me to turn off the lights along my bedroom door and then just stay there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought that I heard our wooden floor downstairs creaking, like someone was trying to be sneaky. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and then quietly opened my door, peeking from underneath. I walked out into our upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I then stupidly yelled, "Hey, is anybody there?" Like they were really going to answer. I thought everything was fine until I saw a large silhouette of somebody standing underneath the balcony. I panicked and then ran to the closest room with a door, which happened to be my small bathroom. The intruder must have known that I noticed them because I heard loud and fast footsteps running up our stairs as I locked myself in the bathroom. I had stupidly left my phone in my bedroom, which was right beside the bathroom. After I built up enough courage, I bolted into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine, and its door was open, so I figured the intruder must have been in there. After locking my bedroom door, I grabbed my phone and typed 911 into it. Just before I called, I had noticed that the storage room in my wall was open just a tad. I saw a dark brown eyeball peeking through the crevice, staring right into my soul. The pure terror that I felt in that moment is something that I will never forget. I booked it down the stairs and out of my front door, running up the hill to my neighbor's house. He was a police officer. He alerted the other cops while I stayed with his wife, and he went down to investigate. I told him about the intruder hiding in my bedroom. Minutes later, I ran back down the hill to see if the intruder had been caught. When I walked in, I saw a tall, skinny man with a gray beard and a dirty black coat being pushed onto the floor by my neighbor as he was getting handcuffed. I'm not allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have better security around our house now. My family was just happy to know that I wasn't hurt, and they were very thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anybody, not even my worst enemy. This story may not be that scary to most, but it certainly scared me at the time. Back in 2016, my sister and I signed a lease for our second apartment together. For some background, we both worked at the same warehouse on the same late night shift, but she worked at the beginning of the week and I worked at the end of the week. Her and her ex-husband had shared custody of their daughter, Sammy, who was with us every other week. On the night of this story, my sister was at work, my mother was visiting for the week, and we were babysitting Sammy and her friend Ashley. Sammy's 8 and her friend Ashley's 9. It was around 9 p.m. Sammy and Ashley were in the living room playing and watching TV. My mom was resting in my sister's room and I was in the bathroom fixing my hair. All of a sudden, I had heard the locked front door open, and my first thought was my sister must have left work early. But that thought quickly left my mind after I noticed two things. 1, I didn't hear my sister's keys with all of that annoying jangling. And 2, my niece didn't immediately scream, "Mommy." I quickly dropped what I was doing and then ran up the small hallway towards the kids. By the time I got up there, the door was closing and the kids were running up to me, freaking out and yelling, "Auntie D! Auntie D!" Sammy started yelling, "A man just walked in and said sorry, and then he walked out." By this time, my mom had gotten up and was in the living room very confused. I told her to take the kids in my room and then calm them down while I grabbed my phone and called maintenance. My apartment complex only had one maintenance guy, and throughout the year that I've been there, I've called him numerous times, and he has let himself in sometimes when I'm not home in response to a request I've made. As soon as he answered, I asked him if he was in the area and had he just walked into my apartment. He told me that he was at least an hour away from the property, and they didn't hire any other maintenance people as of yet. As soon as he said that, my heart dropped. I quickly blurted out that someone just walked into my house and I'm calling the cops now, before I hung up on him and dialed 911. When the police arrived about 10 minutes later, I explained to them what happened, but when they looked at the door, there was no sign of forced entry, so whoever walked into my apartment already had a key. They told me they were going to knock on some doors on the surrounding apartments and then would be right back. 15 minutes later, they came back and told me something that really messed with my sense of security. The person that walked into my apartment was a family member of my neighbor in the next building over. I was 24D and he was 22D, and he actually did just accidentally walk into the wrong apartment. Apparently, the people in control of the complex gave every 4 random apartments the same lock and key set, but the only way the residents would find out is if by chance something like this happened. The maintenance guy came over after the police left and told me that he didn't feel comfortable letting me go to sleep with the same locks. So instead of waiting for the morning, he made a special trip just for me to sleep more comfortably and then changed my locks. I will be forever grateful for him. We moved out of that apartment about a month later and never looked back. Once again, I know this story really wasn't that scary, but I can't stop thinking, what if it was someone who had bad intentions? The first people they would have hurt would have been those kids, and I would have never forgiven myself. While this isn't the most terrifying story on the internet, it's 100% true, and it did cause me some heart-pounding, anxiety-inducing fear at the time that I experienced it. I found out I was pregnant as I wrapped up my first semester in college. My son's father wasn't much further along educationally. We knew it wasn't a good time to become parents, and yet we were naive and ignorant enough to somehow believe we could make it work. Our families were excited. Our son would be the first grandchild on both sides, but neither set of relatives were in a position to help us financially. Grants and our own limited incomes were already paying for our university fees, and yet we managed to score a nice one-bedroom apartment that would allow us to be self-sufficient and raise our son while still finishing our degrees. The problem? Well, the apartment wasn't exactly in the best part of town. Mere blocks away was an area known as the Devil's Triangle. It was infamous for being gang territory, and its zip code had the highest crime rate in the city. We managed to rationalize any fears we had by telling ourselves that we didn't live in the Devil's Triangle, just near it. So it was fine. Plus, the apartment was spacious and well maintained. The whole complex was great, and the manager was very welcoming and fatherly. We signed a 2-year lease and moved in shortly before I gave birth to our 6-pound 8-ounce bouncing baby boy right at Christmas time. Fast forward a few months. By May in Southwest Texas, it's time to start using air conditioning. And air conditioning in a lot of Southwest Texas is swamp cooling. Now, if you don't know what that is, picture a big metal vented box on your roof that's lined with straw-like pads. Water runs over these pads. Air gets sucked through the water-soaked pads, cooling the air, which then gets pumped through the ductwork into your home. It's one way to cool your house. Not the best way, but it's better than nothing. And it works more effectively if you leave your windows cracked just a smidge. This creates a type of vacuum effect that pulls air outside, allowing cool air from ducts to circulate more efficiently through a given room. So it's May, it's late, and we're asleep. The swamp cooler is running. The window is cracked about an inch or two, and my sleeping baby's crib is right next to the window. That's when I hear it. A rustling noise. Metal is brushing against something. It's barely audible yet, and it was just loud enough to wake me up. I listen carefully for a few seconds. The sound is familiar, but I can't place it. It's not the baby. He's still sleeping. But the curtain isn't being sucked towards the cracked window anymore. It's like something is blocking it. I sit up to get a better look. That's when I see the outline of a person right outside our window. The same window my soundly sleeping baby is less than a few feet away from. I jostled my sleeping boyfriend and then quietly whispered, "Charlie, I think someone's breaking in." He groggily looks at the window, listens to the rustling sound, and then says, "It's just the wind. Go back to sleep." That's the moment that I'm able to place the familiar noise. It's someone wiggling the window screen back and forth in an effort to dislodge it. I sit up. My heart is racing. Now I'm panicking. "Someone's breaking in." This time I hiss more loudly, "Charlie, wake up! There's someone breaking in!" I enunciate each word with as much seriousness as I can. He doesn't even open his eyes. No, you're dreaming. Go back to sleep." Now I'm angry. My big, strong, burly protector boyfriend is sawing logs and encouraging me to do the same, all while some shadow figure is prying the screen off my barely open window and my sleeping infant is but a scant distance away. I was going to have to handle this myself. I swung my legs around the bed and standing up, quite livid, I march over to the window, grasping the pull cord to the mini blinds into my shaking fist. I was enraged but also petrified. I ripped up the blinds, and there he was. He had a medium build, a t-shirt, baggy jeans, and a ski mask. Which, by the way, who the hell wears a ski mask when it's this hot outside? He was holding our screen, gripping it in the middle of its frame, one hand on each side. I screamed, then he screamed, then the baby started screaming. Charlie bolted out of bed and stammered, "What's happening? What's going on?" The would-be home invader was apparently so shocked that he took off, running as fast as he could into the night, taking our window screen with him. My heart was pounding out of my chest. Imminent danger averted. I then picked up my son and then pulled him tightly into me. I looked at Charlie and then said, "Someone was breaking in. We need to call the police." The police responded within minutes. They took my statement and started canvassing the area. They returned a short while later, carrying our screen with them. They had found it a few lots over behind a rock wall. That's when we all had a good laugh at the ridiculousness of a potential thief, panic screaming, frightened by an irate mama bear who almost broke her blinds while she rage opened them, while he then ran away carrying a huge window screen. It really does make for a comical scene even after all these years later. The police assured us that the perpetrator was no longer in the area, and they promised to continue patrolling the area for the rest of their shift. After they left, Charlie expressed deep regret over the incident. I wanted to be mad at him, but I just couldn't. We were both severely sleep deprived. We worked full time. We were caring for an infant that woke us up several times a night. And on top of all that, we were always studying for some class or another. It really wasn't his fault. As for the screen thief, he managed to break into several other apartments in our little apartment complex, including the unit directly next to ours. But he was eventually caught after breaking into the wrong apartment. 2 buildings over, there lived an ex-Marine. Like me, he had caught the guy breaking in. Unlike me, he let him get all the way inside before then pistol whipping him unconscious and then calling the police. When my dad and I moved into the small apartment, it was supposed to be a temporary solution while our house underwent renovations. We were adjusting to our new surroundings in the apartment complex, which for the most part was pretty quiet. Most of our neighbors kept to themselves, and life was uneventful, except for one family that lived a couple of doors down from us. The family consisted of a mother and her 2 adult children, a son and a daughter, both in their 20s. From the moment we moved in, it was clear that their household was far from peaceful. It seemed like every other day their arguments would spill out into the common areas of the complex. The son, a tall muscular guy with a constant scowl, and his sister, a petite woman with an equally fiery temper, were always at each other's throats. Their mother, a weary-looking woman with dark circles under her eyes, often tried to mediate, but her efforts were usually in vain. Despite the frequent disturbances, my dad and I tried to mind our own business. After all, we were only going to be there for a few months, and it didn't seem worth getting involved in someone else's family drama. But all of that changed on one sunny afternoon when the arguments escalated into something far more dangerous. I remember the day vividly. It was a lazy Saturday, and I was in my room, trying to focus on a book I'd been meaning to finish. My dad was in the living room tinkering with some electronics, his favorite pastime. It was the usual sounds of the apartment complex. Distant conversations, footsteps, the hum of the appliances providing a comforting background noise. Suddenly, the familiar sound of yelling pierced the tranquility. I sighed and tried to ignore it, thinking it was just another one of their routine arguments. But this time the yelling was different. It was more urgent, more desperate. I put down my book and walked over to the window, curiosity getting the better of me. What I saw next made my blood run cold. The mother and daughter were outside, backing away from the building with terrified expressions on their faces. The son was following them, his face twisted in rage, and in his hand, he held a large kitchen knife. He was shouting something unintelligible, but his intentions were clear. "Dad! I yelled, my voice cracking with a panic. "Come here, quick!" My dad rushed to my side and looked out the window. His eyes widened as he took in the scene. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his phone and bolted for the door. I followed close behind, my heart pounding in my chest. By the time we reached the footpath outside, the situation had escalated even further. The son was now only a few feet away from his mother and sister, who were backed up against the wall with nowhere to go. My dad, who had always been a man of action, didn't waste any time. He lunged at the son, grabbing his arm in an attempt to wrestle the knife away. "Call the police!" he shouted over his shoulder at me. I fumbled my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. My dad and the son were now locked in a struggle, the knife glinting in the sunlight as they fought for control. The mother and daughter watched in horror, too stunned to move.
911, what's your emergency?
The operator's voice crackled through the phone. "There's a man with a knife attacking his family. My dad's trying to stop him. We need help now," I blurted out, giving our address as quickly as I could. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. I watched in terror as my dad managed to pin the son to the ground, finally prying the knife away from his grasp. The son, surprisingly, didn't really resist much after that. He laid there breathing heavily as my dad yelled at him to stay down. Moments later, the sounds of sirens filled the air, and several police cars screeched to a halt in front of the complex. Officers rushed out, guns drawn, and then quickly took control of the situation. They handcuffed the son and led him away, still seething with anger but not putting up a fight. The mother and daughter then collapsed to the ground, now sobbing with relief. My dad, his face pale and his hands trembling, handed the knife over to one of the officers. I stood there still clutching my phone, feeling a mixture of fear and admiration for my father's bravery. One of the officers approached us and took our statements. The mother, once she had composed herself enough to speak, explained that her son had severe anger issues. She told us that he had been struggling for years, and this wasn't the first time he had become violent. She expressed her gratitude to my dad for stepping in and possibly saving their lives. As the police drove the son away, I couldn't help but feel a sense of uneasiness. What if he came back? What if the situation escalated even further next time? These thoughts swirled in my mind as we returned to our apartment, the adrenaline slowly wearing off. For the next few days, the apartment complex was unusually quiet. The usual sounds of life had been replaced by an eerie silence, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The mother and daughter kept to themselves, rarely leaving their apartment. About a month later, we noticed the son had returned. He looked different, more subdued, almost resigned. The mother had mentioned that he was undergoing treatment, but it was hard to believe that a month away could make such a drastic change. Surprisingly, there were no more arguments or yelling matches. The family seemed to have settled into a fragile peace, and the complex slowly returned to its normal state. But the incident had left a lasting impression on me. It was a stark reminder of how quickly life could change, and how important it was to be prepared for the unexpected. As for my dad and I, our bond grew stronger after that day. I had always admired him, but seeing him in action, risking his own safety to protect others, well, it made me realize just how lucky I was to have him. Our time in the apartment was temporary, but the lessons we learned and the experiences we shared during those months would stay with us forever. Eventually, the renovations on our house were completed, and it was time to move back home. As we packed up our belongings and prepared to leave the apartment, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The apartment complex, once just a temporary home, had become a place of growth and learning for me. I looked out the window one last time, taking in the familiar view of the footpath and the rows of the connected houses. The memory of that fateful afternoon was still fresh in my mind, but now it was tempered with a sense of resilience and hope. Life was unpredictable, but with my dad by my side, I knew that we could face whatever challenges came our way. As we drove away, I glanced back at the apartment complex, a small smile playing on my lips. It had been a place of turmoil and fear, but also of courage and strength. And I know no matter where life took us next, I would always carry those lessons with me, ready to face the future with a newfound sense of confidence and determination. My name is Bob, and I've been a fan of this channel for a long time. I'm an older viewer, probably a lot older than most. I'm almost 70 years old now, but the story I want to share happened when I was just 10 years old. Back in the summer of '64, I had a job delivering milk around my neighborhood. Yes, I'm that old. It was a quiet suburb with neat lawns, picket fences, and cozy homes. Every morning before dawn, I would load up my bicycle with clinking glass bottles and pedal through the serene streets. One thing that set our neighborhood apart: the mysterious Mr. Franklin who lived at the end of Elderberry Lane. His house was an old Victorian with dark curtains always drawn. Rumors said that he rarely came out during the day, preferring the cover of night for his activities. I noticed Mr. Franklin during my third week on the milk route. After leaving milk on Miss Thompson's doorstep, another local in the neighborhood, I had felt a shiver down my spine. Turning around, I saw him, Mr. Franklin, standing in his overgrown garden, his pale face framed by messy gray hair. His unsettling smile made my heart race. From then on, I always felt his eyes on me during my deliveries. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of him behind his curtains or see his figure under a street lamp. It seemed that he was always watching but never approaching. As time passed, Mr. Franklin's presence became more real to me. My bike would be moved or I'd hear footsteps behind me in dark alleys. One foggy morning, I saw him standing far away under a streetlight. His smile directed not at me, but something behind me. A chilling sight that made me spin around in fear. Fear became my constant companion. I started taking different routes and avoiding quiet corners where Mr. Franklin might be lurking. Despite my efforts, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Well, one really hot afternoon, seeking refuge from the heat in an abandoned warehouse, I overheard two men talking about Mr. Franklin. They spoke in hushed tones, warning each other about his collection of photos and letters about people in our neighborhood, more specifically some of the children in the neighborhood. They said he watched everyone closely and they needed to keep an eye on me. Well, I couldn't sleep at all later that night. The thought of Mr. Franklin's obsession with collecting information about us gave me the chills. Finally determined to confront him, I set out on my milk route at dawn the next morning. Pedaling down Elderberry Lane, I gathered my courage and knocked on his door.
Come on in, boy.
Mr. Franklin's voice called from inside in a tone of kindness but also menacing at the same time. Mentally preparing myself, I entered his house. The air inside smelled musty from old books, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with files neatly labeled with names of people that I knew from the neighborhood. Mr. Franklin sat at a cluttered desk beneath a dusty chandelier. His smile when he turned to face me was eerie, yet there was a hint of anticipation in his eyes. "You've been watching me," I accused, my voice trembling. Mr. Franklin's smile widened.
Watching, yes. But don't worry. I'm not just watching you, my boy. I watch them all,
he said, gesturing to the files around us. He explained that he was an observer, a collector of stories and lives, trying to understand and capture the essence of what it meant to be alive. His words carried a strange longing, a desire to connect with lives passing him by unnoticed. At this point, I was absolutely horrified, and I wanted out of his house immediately. But curiosity got the best of me. "Why?" I managed to ask, struggling to grasp his obsession. Mr. Franklin looked at me with a mix of disappointment and resignation.
I want to know, to understand,
he said softly.
To possess something of the lives that surround me.
With a newfound resolve, I declared that I wouldn't be part of his collection. Mr. Franklin nodded sadly, and with a wave of his hand, he allowed me to leave. Walking away from Elderberry Lane that morning, I felt relieved yet haunted by the weight of Mr. Franklin's gaze. Over the years, the neighborhood changed, replaced by modern streets and buildings. But the memory of Mr. Franklin and his unsettling obsession remained etched into my mind, a reminder of how darkness can hide beneath ordinary facades. Though I've moved on and built a different life for myself, there are nights when I find myself staring into the darkness, half expecting to see Mr. Franklin's figure with that unsettling smile. I've always been good at blending in, at becoming part of the background. It's a skill that served me well over the years, especially now as I watch her, the young woman in apartment 3B. From my vantage point across the courtyard behind the safety of drawn curtains and a partially open window, I observe her daily routines with a mix of fascination and longing. And if by now you couldn't already tell, this is a different kind of story. The one where I'm the creeper. Anyways, she doesn't know me. Not really. To her, I'm just another face in the building. Perhaps a neighbor she passes in the hallway or nods to in the elevator. But to me, she is my everything. Her name is Sarah. I learned that from the mailbox one afternoon when I chanced to see her retrieve her mail. Sarah with the easy smile and the infectious laugh that echoes down the corridor on occasion. I know her schedule almost as well as my own. In the mornings, she emerges from her apartment at precisely 7:45, dressed for work in smart blouses and pencil skirts that accentuate her figure. She carries a sleek black briefcase and often stops by the coffee shop on the corner before then disappearing into the throng of the city's morning rush. I've imagined countless scenarios where our paths might cross naturally. Perhaps at the corner cafe where I could strike up a casual conversation about the weather or the latest news. But I know better than to risk the fragile fabric of my carefully constructed reality. No, it's safer to remain in the shadows, to watch and to wait. During the day, I occupy myself with mundane tasks, an errand here, a trip to the grocery store there, all the while keeping one ear tuned to the hum of life in the apartment complex. Occasionally, I'll catch glimpses of her through the frosted glass of her kitchen window as she prepares dinner or unwinds after a long day. Nights are the hardest, when the silence of the building presses in around me like a suffocating blanket. That's when I find myself drawn to the window, drawn to the faint glow of light from apartment 3B. Sometimes she reads, curled up on the couch with a book held close to her chest. Other times she watches television, the flickering screen casting shadows across her face. I wonder what occupies her thoughts during those quiet moments. Does she think of me, the faceless neighbor who watches her from across the courtyard? Or does she go about life, oblivious to the silent presence that hovers on the periphery of her world? I've tried to rationalize my obsession, to convince myself that it's harmless, that it's merely a passing fascination. But the truth is far more insidious. I can't tear myself away from her. The need to know her, to understand her. It consumes me in ways that I just can't explain. Tonight is no different. As I stand at the window, the darkness outside broken only by the soft glow of streetlights, my gaze inevitably drifts to apartment 3B. I see movement. A flicker of movement that draws me closer to the glass, my breath fogging the window pane. She's there, framed against the lamplight from the living room, her silhouette ethereal and distant. There's a vulnerability about her in these moments, a rawness that she only reveals when she thinks no one's watching. And yet, I'm watching. I'm always watching. Suddenly she turns,
as if sensing my gaze from across the courtyard. My heart lurches in my chest, and for a fleeting instant, our eyes meet through the glass. Panic surges through me, threatening to unravel the fragile threads of my carefully constructed facade. But then she smiles, a small knowing smile that sends a shiver down my spine. Does she recognize me? Does she even understand the depths of my obsession, the lengths to which I've gone to remain hidden in plain sight? Or is it merely a trick of the light, a figment of my fevered imagination? I drew back from the window, retreating into the darkness of my own apartment. The weight of my guilt settles heavily on my shoulders. I know that what I'm doing is wrong, that my fixation on her is unhealthy and dangerous. Yet still, I find myself drawn back to the window, drawn back to the quiet sanctuary of apartment 3B. For in those stolen moments of observation, I catch fleeting glimpses of a life that I can never truly be a part of. A life that only exists beyond the confines of my own fractured reality. And so I continue to watch, to wait, to yearn for a connection that may never come. For in the end, I'm nothing more than the watcher in the shadows, forever bound to the object of my obsession by the invisible threads of desire and regret. Hey everyone, I want to share a story that really shook up me and my boyfriend. A couple of years ago, I moved to the UK for university. It was a big move for me, but I needed to get away from my parents' toxic situation back home. My first year at uni was spent in student accommodation where I met some really awesome people and enjoyed my newfound independence. I didn't meet my boyfriend until later, but life felt good. By my second year, I decided to move into a house with some friends that we rented through the university. It was nice to have our own space and not worry about noise restrictions like we did in our small shared flat the year before. My room was on the ground floor with a window that looked out into a small yard. I'd often go out there to smoke. There was an old thin wooden door that led to the street where we kept our bins and stuff. The door could only be locked from inside the backyard, so we tied it shut with some strings to keep it closed properly. We had neighbors on both sides. On one side were 5 guys who seemed much older than university students. They were a bit strange. One day there was a police incident involving them. One guy had attacked his flatmates with a kitchen knife and set their kitchen on fire. It was really scary to see one of them covered in cuts and blood. My flatmates and I helped clean him up and gave him a shirt to wear. The police took the guy away who caused all the trouble, but the guy we helped out was odd. He talked nonsense and made unwanted advances towards me. We noticed that he smoked a lot of marijuana, but we tried to be helpful and didn't think much about it at the time. After that incident, I'd see him around sometimes whenever I was coming home from uni or running errands. He once approached me on the street near a corner shop and tried to start a strange conversation. I felt really uncomfortable and ignored him. He said something creepy like, "I'll wait for you in front of your house so we can talk." I brushed it off as a joke, bought my drink, and headed back home. But as I turned into my street, there he was with his flatmate sitting on my doorstep. I panicked and called my male flatmate to ask him to tell them to leave, but he wasn't home. I waited nervously until they finally left an hour later. I rushed back home, locked the door, and felt relieved. Despite this, things got worse. One day while smoking in the backyard, I noticed the wood door was open. The strings we used to keep it closed were cut. I closed the door again and put on a new string, assuming it was just a mistake by one of the flatmates. Those weird neighbors often fought loudly, which disturbed my flatmates and me at night. We got used to it after a while though. One evening, my boyfriend stayed over as usual. He woke up suddenly in the middle of the night because of a loud noise and whispering. He woke me up quietly, and we listened in the dark. Suddenly, the wooden door banged open, and we heard footsteps near my window. We froze as we heard the backyard door being shaken, like someone was trying to break in. Thankfully, our curtains were closed, so they couldn't see us. We were ready to dress quickly and escape through the window if they came in. Then we heard my window open some more, and one of the guys spoke in a language that we didn't understand. They were trying to get in. My boyfriend and I jumped out of bed, grabbed my phone, got dressed, and then ran out of the room and out of the house. I called my flatmates and then the police. Luckily, the police station was nearby, and they arrived in less than 5 minutes. I was in shock, and I don't remember much after the police came. They caught one of the guys, but the other escaped. Later on, they found him a few streets away smoking weed. The police searched their house and they found drugs and a huge kitchen knife. It really terrified me to think they were trying to break in with such dangerous intentions. I never did anything to provoke them, so I couldn't understand why they targeted me and my boyfriend. One of them was sentenced to 2 years in prison for carrying a weapon with intent to harm. I moved back home a few months later because I was so scared and I couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if my boyfriend hadn't woken up. I'm still coping with the trauma to this day. I often wake up from the slightest noise and have nightmares, but I'm really grateful to have my boyfriend by my side. We talk about it often, which helps me feel better.
I used to work the night shift at the front desk of an apartment building. The lobby area had a desk, and I was in charge of buzzing people in through the door. I was essentially a layer of security. I would ensure that whoever was coming into the building lived there or was a friend of somebody and had received approval to enter. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., so there wasn't usually much action going on during my shift, especially after midnight. One night, I was in the middle of my shift, trying not to fall asleep. Suddenly, I saw movement on one of the cameras from the garage. The garage was attached to the building, but to get inside, you still needed to come up to the main doors and be buzzed in by me. Someone was walking through the garage towards the stairs that would take them towards the lobby area. I hadn't seen anybody drive into the garage and park their car, but I was pretty tired and could have missed it easily. I watched as the person entered the stairs and made their way up towards the door to get into the lobby. They immediately tugged to open the door, apparently not knowing that they had to be buzzed in by me. It was a younger man. He was maybe right around his 30s. He looked in at me through the glass, motioning for me to open the door. It was clear that he did not live here, so I walked over towards the entry doors, motioning for him to leave. The man started explaining that he was here to see his friend and needed to get in. I had received no warning about this man, and there was no note that would indicate that he was supposed to be granted access to the building. The man glared angrily at me when I once again said that I wasn't going to be letting him in. He began pounding on the door, and while his arms were raised, I saw that he had a gun tucked into his waistband as well. The man was quite strong, and I was genuinely worried that the glass might break. I scurried back to my desk, alerting the authorities, and letting them know that a man with a gun was attempting to enter the apartment building. After a few moments, the man stopped pounding on the glass, and once again glared at me. He shouted that he would be back, and disappeared down the stairway back towards the garage. I watched on the cameras as he exited the garage and disappeared outside into the night. I ended up only working that night shift a couple more weeks, not seeing the man again. I have no idea if he ever showed up overnight again since I had stopped working there, but I wish the next night shift worker good luck if they ever did or do see him again. I spend the nights working as a security officer. My job is to travel around to various buildings, mostly businesses that hire my company for security. I swing by each of these places multiple times at night, ensuring that nothing funny is going on and the building is secure. Honestly, my job is really boring. As you can picture that on a night-to-night basis, not much is going on around an office building. I'm required to walk around each entry point to the building, making sure that it's locked and secure. I have keys to all these buildings in case I need to go inside, but in the 3 months working this night shift, I never had to go inside a building. However, that all changed during a shift I had 2 weeks ago. I had reached my third building of the night, which was a smaller 4-story office building. I made my rounds around the perimeter of the building, shining my light up at windows, ensuring they were intact, and pulling on doors, making sure they were locked. I circled around to the back side of the building. When I did, I was shocked to see that a door was not only unlocked, but also propped open. I never had to deal with a situation like this before, and quite frankly, I was nervous to go inside the building. I maneuvered my way through the building, moving very slowly and shining my flashlight into every room and corner. It took me a while, especially since I was nervous, but I made my way through all 4 floors of the building without seeing anything unusual. I made my way back to the door that had been left open, removing the prop in the door and locking it behind me. I continued my rounds, making my way through the rest of the buildings that needed to be checked for the night. I decided to head back over to the office building that I had walked through earlier to make sure that everything was okay. I pulled my truck into the parking lot and began walking around the building doing rounds once more. To my surprise, the same back exit was once again unlocked and propped open. At this point, I was very confused. There wasn't supposed to be anyone still in the building this late, and there were no lights inside that I could see. I reluctantly entered the office building once again and searched it from top to bottom, this time even calling out multiple times to see if anyone was there. Once again, I saw and heard nothing unusual my entire trip throughout the building. I returned to the back exit and saw that the door was now closed. I hadn't unpropped the door when I first entered the building, but now the door was closed, and the brick that had been used to prop it open was nowhere in sight. Again, this was my first time having to enter a building while I had this job, so I was a little scared at this point. I quickly locked the door and hurried back to the safety of my truck. Nobody was supposed to be in that building, so I was relieved that I hadn't ended up seeing anybody during my rounds of the building. It was eerie to me, though, that during both of my searches of the building, somebody had been in there somewhere, evading me, and then slipped out the back door without me seeing them. I called the office building the next day, asking if anything important was missing or had been stolen, but nothing they were aware of was gone. I still currently work the security night shift job, but haven't had any nights like that one at the office building since then, thankfully. I'm retired now, but for a couple of years in my 50s, I worked a night shift in a mall. I was a custodian and would come in and clean once the mall had closed for the night. Most of my nights were spent cleaning up the food court areas, as well as taking care of bathrooms. One night, I was sweeping the floor in the food court area, and I heard a fit of coughing coming from somewhere. I looked around the dimly lit food court area, but didn't see anyone. A couple of times throughout my years working there, I would discover somebody or a group of people who had hidden in the mall and were doing a challenge of staying there overnight. I didn't see anyone, and I heard no further noises, so I just continued cleaning. If someone was trying to stay in the mall overnight, I'd see them eventually, unless they stayed put in one spot the entire time. About 15 minutes had passed, and I was wiping off tables now. Suddenly, a series of loud bangs startled me. I looked up and saw that a whole table and all the surrounding chairs had been knocked over onto the ground. I walked over to the items on the ground, which had happened near the edge of the food court. There was no one to be seen anywhere. I ventured down away from the food court a bit to see if I could see anyone running away or hiding. I was about to turn around back to the food court when I heard water running inside the women's bathroom. All the bathrooms at the mall had sinks that were motion sensors. Someone had to be inside of the bathroom, and I had a feeling that it was going to be the culprit I was looking for from the food court. The sink was still running as I slowly and as quietly as I could entered the bathroom. As I turned the corner into the bathroom, the water abruptly stopped running. There was nobody anywhere to be seen. I checked every stall and still nothing. I chalked it up to a faulty sensor on the sink and decided that I'd put in a work order for maintenance to fix it. Oddly enough, as I walked away from the bathroom, I heard the sink turn on again. I walked back to the food court, very confused and also a little spooked. I went about the rest of my night as usual, finishing my cleaning duties. A couple days later, I received an email from maintenance that there had been nothing wrong with the sink sensor and that it was functioning normally. From then on, at least once a week, I would hear the water running from the sink in that bathroom. For the rest of the time that I worked at the mall, I just accepted that I wasn't alone in that mall, and I stayed away from that bathroom. I never had any more incidents, though, with the mysterious knocking over tables and chairs in the food court. Thankfully, that spirit, or whatever it was, stayed in the women's bathroom.
Halloween has always been one of my favorite nights of the entire year. From the pagan origins to the more modern take of trick-or-treating, corny movies, and dressing up, I just can't get enough. One Halloween, similar to many others, my friends and I decided that we were going to go trick-or-treating. Now, admittedly, we were probably a little old, but it was our tradition, and we always had so much fun. We went from house to house getting candy and getting some looks from parents who probably also felt we were a little old. It was a largest group of people, including my current crush at the time, which made the night even more fun. The houses in this area were the ones that gave up full-size candy bars, and most people had their homes all decked out in state-of-the-art Halloween decor. As we approached one of the last houses before we were going to call it quits, I noted a particularly scary figure on the front lawn. It looked like a person waiting to jump out and scare us as we walked by. It was a tall figure, with a white mask and black covering the eyes. It was hard to tell if it was a mannequin or a person because it was so still. As I walked by, the tall figure grabbed my arm, causing me to almost crap my pants. The man got down to my face and said in a slow, soft voice through his mask, "Tag, you're it," and then ran into the backyard of the house. We all screamed, laughed, and ran to the front door for candy. Of course, we just assumed this was part of the homeowners trying to scare people who were trick-or-treating. We got our candy, and as I walked away, I turned back to the lady in the doorway and said, "That tall guy was really scary, but you might want to tell him not to grab people so hard as they walk by." The woman looked at me like I had grown a second head. I asked if she was all right, and she responded in an almost nervous voice, "You're the second young lady tonight to tell me the same story tonight. My husband's inside, and we don't have anyone set up outside to scare you kids." Now I'm officially creeped out. I ran to catch up to my friend, still thinking it was still all possibly part of a scare and the lady was just messing with me. The group of us stayed out for a little while longer. Some of us broke off from the larger group and began to walk back to my house. We decided that first we were going to walk by the house where the incident had occurred earlier in the night to see if the tall guy was set up for another scare. When we walked by it, the entire house was black, like they had ran out of candy or left for the night. From the sidewalk, I looked into the backyard, and there, the same guy with the white mask. He waved at me, and my friends told me to just ignore it, and it was obviously someone who lived there and was trying to scare us. Once we were almost to my house, I looked back and saw the guy was following us. I yelled, "Hey, what's your problem?" The entire group then turned around and tried to duck out of the way so we wouldn't see him. At this point, I think my friends could tell I was getting generally freaked out. Once we got inside, I felt more safe, and my mind was able to drift away from thinking about that guy. We all hung out for a little while, trading candy, gossiping, and watching TV. Occasionally, someone would make a comment about me being scared of the tall man, and we all laughed and just had some fun with the situation. Once my friends left for the night, I got ready for bed. I was sitting in my bedroom, taking my makeup off, and I just glanced out my window. And there in my backyard was a person. I couldn't believe my eyes. I thought I was seeing things. I went downstairs into the living room to see if I could get a better view of the figure in the yard. The tall man in the mask was now at my back door and was trying to break into the house. He was shaking the door handle and trying to open the door. I screamed for my dad, and then he saw I was standing there. He just looked up and waved at me again, just like before. My dad came barreling down the stairs and the guy didn't even move. My dad called 911, and luckily they were nearby because they showed up in 2 minutes. They arrested the guy and took him in from the backyard to the cop car. I'll never forget how he looked. They removed the expressionless mask, and somehow his real face had even less of an expression. He was clean cut, with short, dirty blonde hair. His eyes didn't even blink and his mouth remained shut. There was no expression, almost a lifeless look. But as they put him into the cop car, he took one last look back and a creepy smile came across the lifeless face. A smile of a person who clearly didn't have a full comprehension of what was going on. I still think back to that Halloween night, and even with how bad that experience was, I am thankful it wasn't worse.
I'm a 26-year-old female. This happened about a decade ago. I still remember it like it was yesterday. A little information first. When I was 13, I was 5'10" and was often mistaken for at least 16 years old. At the time, I lived with my uncle, Jared, along with his wife, 2 daughters, and my grandma. Jared started his own business as a pool and spa man, including repairs and cleaning, and lifting heavy chemicals and other supplies for his business. He's very good at his job. He's one of those guys people generally like and get along with. We live in Southern California in a nice area, and many rich people live here because the weather is usually sunny and rarely gets more than about 80 degrees Fahrenheit all year long, despite changing seasons. Naturally, he has quite a few customers that are pretty wealthy. One of these customers was a middle-aged woman. She invited my uncle to attend a huge Halloween party that she was hosting at her place. She said that he and his family were welcomed as guests. You see, my uncle was and still is to this day a huge fan of Halloween, as well as a fan of scaring people. That was something we've always had in common. So when he heard she was going to have a haunted maze in her avocado orchard, he took her up on her offer and invited me as well. Though I'm not big into parties, I didn't hesitate to say yes, since I would be working the haunted orchard with him. The party was fun and they had good catered food, but I mostly stuck to my family members, trying my best to enjoy the party. But I was much more excited about working the maze. About an hour before the maze opened up, my uncle and I went to go and get ready in our costumes. He went off to one of the vacant parts of her huge house, while I went to get ready in the guest house. My job was to be more of a distraction for the people to pass by in the maze. I was dressed in a shorter Victorian-era dress, with fake stage blood covering my body and clothes. Overall, I looked as if I'd been hung by a noose from one of the orchard trees. The plan was to have small groups going into the maze, one group at a time, and I was to be still, drawing people's sights away from Jared, who dressed as Michael Myers with an actual chainsaw, which didn't really match his character. He was right across the path from me, hidden in the shadows. He would then rev up the chainsaw, and people would run screaming while he chased them down the path. Half an hour into the job, and everything went without a hitch. But that didn't last. I heard some loud talking down the dark path, so I got back into character, amused by people's drunken screams. I could hear about 5 different voices then. They all sounded like men. Their words were slurred, so I assumed they'd been drinking. The hostess had served alcohol at the party, so I didn't think twice on it. A lot of people drank before going into the maze. I had an uneasy feeling growing in my gut, but I completely ignored it. After all, I was a naive 13-year-old girl who thought she would be safe at a private party. I remember thinking that my uncle had been nearby, so I wasn't all too worried. "Well, looky there," one of them said. I heard someone laugh and make catcalls. "She's a cutie." I remember my breath freezing in my chest, and my uneasiness returned. I was the only person visible, so I knew that they had to be talking to me. I tried to look out into the dark, but I couldn't see anyone due to a spotlight that was shining on me from my feet. It wasn't until they were about 15 feet away that I finally see the outlines of these men. "Wow, she is," another man said as they walked closer to me. I was past the point of unease and just plain scared, so much so that I completely froze in fear. Though taller than most, I was still just a kid, and all 5 of these men were about my height or taller. There was no way to fight off or run from them. The men approached me, and I remember they completely reeked of booze. Only one or two of the guys' faces were half illuminated by the spotlight. The others' faces were at an angle where they were completely black from the shadow, and I remember cursing the spotlight for shining directly in my face. "Hey there, baby," one of them said, getting closer to me. He was literally only inches from me as he and another guy reached out their hands to touch me. "How about we leave this place and go have some fun instead?" "Get away from me," I remember saying, finally finding my voice. "Aw, baby, don't be like that," he dragged out. By this point, his other friends were surrounding me to where I was blocked off completely. I looked past them to my uncle's area, but I didn't see him anywhere. He must have chased that last group further down the path. I was completely alone. The man had reached toward my chest, but I slapped his hand away as hard as I could. I said, "Get away from me." My heart beat so loud and fast in my ears, I turned and tried pushing past them so I could run down the path and find Jared, but they used their bodies to make a wall and keep me from leaving. "What's the matter? Are we not good enough for you?" one of them said, taking hold of my arm. I pulled it against his grasp to try and run, and I mentally prepared for the worst. I remember taking in a deep breath to scream, hoping that someone would take it as an actual sign I was in trouble, not just another person who was being chased in the labyrinth. Then suddenly, I heard the beginning rev of a chainsaw, and all the men looked off in the darkness, where my uncle's figure as Michael Myers appeared in the reflecting glow from my spotlight. I'd never been so grateful to see a serial killer icon in my life. "What are you doing to my niece?" he demanded, rapidly stepping closer to them. I remember being so relieved to the point of almost crying, but I stopped myself. From the look on these men's faces, this 6'4" man, who was strongly built, due to the job he worked 6 to 7 days a week, dressed in an orange prison jumpsuit, a Michael Myers mask, and a very real chainsaw in his hands, translated to someone who could easily mess them up for messing with his niece. They started to back away from me, but one guy smiled nervously and said, "Hey man, it's cool, we're just leaving." Then he turned to me, and he said with this eerie, disturbing smile, "We'll see you later, babe." His hand brushed lightly over my stomach. I froze again, chills running up and down my spine. The man then ran off down the path, my uncle cussing at them and threatening to call the cops as they scurried off even faster. He would have run after them, probably would have done something drastic too, if I hadn't run over into his arms and began to cry. I was shaking violently as the adrenaline wore off. He hugged me, then pulled out his cell phone to call my grandma. She soon arrived, and all three of us went to go and find the hostess to tell her what happened. Sadly, I don't think she was able to do anything, due to me only being able to give vague descriptions of the men, as they were mostly in shadow. And if she did, and I certainly didn't hear anything about it. Even to this day, I can't help but think what could have happened to me that night if Jared hadn't shown up when he did. There's been a couple of times where the lady has thrown more Halloween parties. I still go and work for the haunted maze, but I'm never in direct view anymore. I will actively partake in scaring the people. I've yet to be harassed like that ever again while working there, especially since I found out my true scare tactic, crawling like a fast-moving grudge towards people. I have 3 pieces of advice to anyone who works in a haunted attraction of sorts. 1. Just because you work there doesn't mean people won't start trouble with you, even during a private event. 2. Always be close to another worker, just in case something happens. And 3. Always be aware of your surroundings. Just because you're the one doing the scaring doesn't mean you won't be the one to have experienced traumatic events by the end of the night. The Treehouse, from Dark Rider 88. Halloween was always my favorite holiday growing up. Dressing up, eating candy, pulling pranks. What's not to love? But ever since that one Halloween night when I was 12 years old, I've never looked at October 31st the same way again. I grew up in a quiet suburb of Denver full of families and kids my age. My parents had moved there when I was young because it seemed like such a safe, friendly neighborhood. And it was, for the most part. But maybe nowhere is totally safe from the darker side of things. Anyway, Halloween was a big deal in our community. Everyone would decorate their houses, and kids would spend weeks picking out costumes and planning trick-or-treat routes to hit the best candy spots. My friends and I loved sorting through our halls after a long night knocking on doors. I had two best friends who lived on my block, Josh and Tyler. One year when we were 12, on Halloween afternoon, we hung out in the treehouse in my backyard, planning out our costumes and strategies for that night. We were going to go as the Ghostbusters crew, complete with homemade proton packs my dad helped us build. We could barely contain our excitement as we helped each other with our costumes before heading out around dusk. It was the perfect night, just chilly enough to warrant a jacket, clear skies, and a bright moon. Josh, Tyler, and I set out with our parents trailing behind to supervise. We made our way up and down the neighborhood streets, ringing doorbells and yelling the usual trick or treat at each house. Things were going great. Our bags were loaded up with candy in no time. After a couple hours, we were ready to call it quits. Josh and Tyler came back to my house so we could go through our hauls together. We dumped out all the goods on the floor of the treehouse and started sorting it into piles: chocolate, fruity candy, and salty snacks. We were deep in trading negotiations when Tyler said he had to pee. The restrooms were all the way inside, so he said he'd just duck behind a tree at the back of the yard. Josh and I went back to swapping candy as we waited. A couple minutes passed, and Tyler still wasn't back. Josh and I joked that maybe he fell in, but when it had been over 5 minutes, we started to get worried. The tree Tyler went behind was only like 20 feet from the treehouse. There's no way using the bathroom would take this long. Josh and I climbed down from the treehouse and slowly walked toward where we last saw Tyler head. As we made our way across the lawn, the wind picked up, scattering leaves at our feet. The moon above was obscured by clouds passing in front of it. We were halfway to the tree when a blood-curdling scream pierced the night. It sounded like Tyler, but twisted and raw in a way I'd never heard before. Josh and I froze, staring wide-eyed at each other. Then we heard it again, that awful guttural scream coming from the dark shape of the tree. We ran inside, yelling for our parents. My dad and Josh's mom came sprinting out. We were crying, trying to explain what we heard. The adults searched the backyard with flashlights, but found nothing. No sign of Tyler or whatever made that horrifying sound. Josh's mom ran to Tyler's house, while my dad called 911. The police showed up, but also found no trace of him. Needless to say, trick-or-treating was over for the night. Josh's mom stayed with us, as we all anxiously awaited news. Around midnight, a knock finally came at the door. It was Tyler, escorted by a police officer. He looked completely normal, not scared or hurt at all. When we asked what happened, he seemed confused. Tyler said he just went to pee behind the tree and came right back, but we weren't in the treehouse anymore. He assumed we went inside without him. Of course, we were incredulous. There's no way Tyler could have made it back to the treehouse without us seeing him in that tiny backyard. And we definitely heard those screams that sounded just like him. Tyler insisted he never screamed and that he just took a quick pee break. Our parents were disturbed and relieved at the same time. We were all sufficiently freaked out, so Tyler just went home after that. I slept with the covers over my head that night, listening for any screams from outside my window, but none came. The next day, things felt relatively back to normal. We still had fun trading candy and telling ghost stories like any other post-Halloween, but there was an unspoken unease whenever we made eye contact. Each of us knew what we heard and that it didn't come from our friend. Tyler moved away the next year, and Josh and I drifted apart in high school. But we've never spoken about that night again. I haven't been trick-or-treating since, even now in my 20s. I get anxious as soon as the sun starts going down on Halloween. These days, Shadows seemed to move in a way they shouldn't, carrying whispers of the unexplained. Whatever terrifying presence visited my backyard that night, I don't intend to encounter it ever again. This story took place back in 2016, during the clown craze that was going on. My local church has a Halloween-themed carnival every year, and my friends and I decided it would be fun to help out with setting up the carnival and helping run the games. I met up with my friends A and C after school the day of the festivities, because where it was being held was within walking distance of our high school. On our way there, we noticed a man in a clown costume standing right near one of the houses, which was next to the high school. I was already nervous of clowns to begin with, so when I saw him, I instantly became paranoid. But I brushed it off. It was Halloween after all, and it was probably just someone dressed up for trick-or-treating, even though it was a bit early, at 3 p.m. We continued walking on down to the clearing where the carnival was being held. We helped things get set up and got into our costumes. Before long, we were having a great time. At about 7 p.m., there weren't that many people left showing up, so we took off walking around the downtown area, more specifically one of the nearby streets. They go all out for Halloween here, and A really wanted to see the decorations. C and I agreed, so off we went. There were skeletons and headstone decorations and tall inflatables as far as the eye could see. We were mesmerized by it all. It took us a minute to notice the same clown guy from earlier standing near one of the headstones. His costume had fiery orange hair, and the makeup on the mask was funny, as if he just painted over the makeup that was already on it. His clothing was black and white striped, with a huge black and white polka dot neck collar. I was creeped out at that point, but A and C thought it would be marvelous to taunt him and make fun of his costume. I was like, guys, you shouldn't do that. Let's just go. After throwing a few more insults, they gave in to my pleas. We turned and walked back in the direction we came from, away from that clown. Now, there's a store at the end of the street, and a little further down is a donut shop. But in between the two was a long path that went right through a wooded area that had little to no lighting at all, and was very creepy at night. C spoke up, saying, "Why don't we walk this way? There's no cars, so we'd be less likely to get run over." As if that would happen, A said. We started walking carefully down the path, beginning to talk about the typical stuff teenage girls talk about. Boys we liked, people we couldn't stand, so on and so forth. We heard footsteps fast approaching behind us. We turned around. There was the same clown we'd already seen twice that night. But instead of just standing still and staring at us, he was now running at a full sprint towards us. He was waving what looked to be a butcher knife above his head, like some sort of maniac. We took off as fast as we could, running toward where the carnival was being held. He was catching up quick though, when, by the grace of God, he must have tripped over a fallen branch. Because when we turned around, he was slowly getting back up off the ground. We did not waste the opportunity. We took off, finally making it back to the carnival. When we got there, we explained to our pastor what happened. He ended up calling the police. Eventually, an officer showed up, taking our statements and searching the nearby area. He found nothing, save for the knife the clown had laid in the dirt where he'd fallen. Our pastor took us home, as we were too scared to be out anymore. This may not be the scariest story, but it's definitely one that has stuck with me for years. I'm 22 now, and to this day, I'm absolutely terrified of clowns.
In this wonderful modern time, we have the luxury of ordering just about any food we want for delivery. It's easy to get anything from pizza to a chicken sandwich. On the flip side, we can take jobs as delivery drivers and make a few bucks on the side. It's easy work, and when you're a single mother like me, any extra income is good income. A few weeks ago, I delivered some food to a nice suburban community. It was one of those neighborhoods you'd see on a Disney Channel show. Nice houses, picket fences, you know the neighborhoods I'm talking about. And like all the deliveries I make, I'm supposed to take a picture of the food at the front door. Think of it as like an insurance policy in case the food is at the wrong house or stolen or something weird happens. I place the food in front of the door on top of the small staircase that leads to the door. I took a few steps back and took a picture of it. After taking the picture, I was walking back to my car when I was confronted by an extremely angry and enraged woman who came out from the house across the street. I asked her what her problem was, and she just kept screaming at me, saying that it was private property and that I was trespassing. I tried explaining one time to the woman what I did and why I took the picture, and it did not compute in her tiny little brain. After being continuously cut off every time I tried to speak, I decided to just get into my car and drive away. I tried being nice, but clearly this woman was insane. I got inside my car and was checking my phone for another delivery. The woman started to bang on the hood of my car, causing me to jump from being startled. I got out of the car aggressively to see if there was any damage, and she ran back to her house. There was no damage, but I was so done with this delivery and I decided to just call it a night. I ended up driving home and spending the evening with my daughter. We ate dinner, played some games, and watched a movie together. I put her to bed and started binge-watching one of my favorite shows, and I would have guessed that it was around midnight when I heard someone knocking at my front door, knocking rather aggressively, I might add. I couldn't believe what I was looking at through the peephole in the door. It was the crazy woman from the delivery earlier in the day. I didn't answer. I didn't even say anything. I just kept watching this woman, trying to figure out what she was doing at my house. She had to have followed me home, which was already insanely creepy, and while I was watching her, she went over to the walkway that led to my front door. From the driveway, I have this path of little stones that leads to the front door. It's not like big slabs of pavement, but rather small stones that almost fit together like a mosaic. The woman grabbed one of the stones, roughly the size of an average dinner plate, and put it behind her back. She started to knock on the door again, still concealing the stone behind her back. And this is where things get very weird. I didn't answer the door, but I shouted to her that I had called the police. And this must have scared her because she threw the stone at my house and ran away. I did end up calling the police and reporting what happened. They followed up, but nothing really came of it, and that was the end of the story until recently. If that was all that happened, that would be scary enough, not knowing what she wanted from me and her showing up in the middle of the night. But things got much worse. About a week after the incident, I saw the woman at the grocery store. No confrontation or anything like that, but then I saw her several other times just driving. Again, no confrontation or anything else. I wanted to say it was just a coincidence, but it almost felt a little too weird. I have a friend who is married to a cop, and I talked to him about it. I explained that something felt off, but it's possible that it was just pure chance that I kept noticing her, and he agreed. He basically said that because I'm aware of this woman, I'm subconsciously picking her out of the crowd in our town. I didn't like that answer, but I guess technically he was right. It is a pretty smallish town after all. And this brings me to about a week ago as of me writing this account. I just got my daughter on the bus and I was outside pulling some weeds. While I was on the ground, I could feel someone standing over me. I turned around, and it was that woman. The same damn woman from that stupid delivery. I was completely vulnerable in that position and I didn't know what to do. And she said in a sort of soft but angry voice, "You're a monster for calling the cops. You're a trespasser." I noticed that she had one of my stones again, and without thinking, flight mode kicked in, and I got up and ran as fast as I could. She actually tried hitting me with a stone, but she missed. I ran inside and locked the door. I called the police and told them that she was back and trying to hit me with a rock. The police showed up, and this time, they arrested that crazy woman. It turns out that that woman had some pre-existing history of mental health. I'm not exactly sure what it was. And because this is so fresh, I don't exactly know what happened to her. I saw her get taken away in the back of a squad car because she was still at my house when the police came. I just hope this nightmare is over. At least for now, it seems to be over. I just hope that she gets the help that she needs and that I never have to see her crazy face again. In my early 20s, I had a knack for spending more money than I could afford. When I got my first real taste of making money, it's not an understatement to say that I was reckless. One of the first things I did was get a new car with extremely high payments. Instead of leasing a smaller, cheaper car, I decided that I was going to buy a BMW. It's not a top-of-the-line one, but still a BMW, and my payments were over $600 a month, which may not seem like a lot for some people, but for me, it was crippling. I barely made enough money to pay my bills, and I still lived with my parents at the time, and so I found myself doing all sorts of tasks for friends and family members to make some extra money. I regularly watched my friend Dom's dog. Dom had to go out of state every other weekend for his job, and since he didn't have a wife or girlfriend, he had me as his dog sitter. And I did this for about 6 months and honestly loved the job. He lived in a nice and quiet neighborhood. The dog, Willard, was a golden retriever and was such a good dog, not to mention easy to care for. And these bi-monthly trips to Dom's were something I looked forward to. But like most good things in the world, it eventually came to an end. I'm sorry about the pessimistic attitude, but the last time I watched Willard, the evening started like every other weekend dog-sitter trip. We'd play in the yard for a while, go for a walk, and then wind down at around 9 p.m. One of the reasons why Dom trusted me was because he knew I could never have people over or anything like that because I would work early in the mornings on the weekends. Usually I would be asleep around 10, but on this Saturday night, I was invested in a movie that ended a little after 11. The movie was Inception, just in case you were wondering. And after the movie, I let Willard out while I got myself ready for bed. I always felt weird about sleeping in Dom's bedroom, so I would usually sleep on the couch with the dog. Just as I was getting comfortable, the doorbell rang. I looked at the clock and it was about 11:16 p.m. My mind immediately went to someone in Dom's family. I couldn't imagine anybody else ringing the doorbell in his neighborhood at this hour, and I rushed to the door, and standing on the other side was a young man, most likely in his early 20s like me. He looked clean-cut and didn't have a threatening presence about him, and I opened the front door but kept the outer screen door shut and locked. And talking through the screen, I asked him if I could help him with something, and he didn't seem weird or sketchy. And in a very confident voice, he said to me, "Hey man, I got the food you ordered." And 2 things I feel like I need to mention here. 1, this was before all the food ordering apps, so your food never just got dropped off at the door. You had to physically go and pay for the food at the door and have an interaction with the delivery driver. And 2, you're probably assuming that Willard is like most dogs and that she's barking like crazy at someone ringing the doorbell. Well, she isn't like most dogs. Not only did she not bark, but she stayed on the living room couch the entire time I had an interaction with that delivery driver. I was kind of annoyed by this more than anything. I definitely wasn't scared. I mean, why would I be? I had no reason to believe that this was anything other than just some mistake. I explained to the guy that he had the wrong address and that I didn't order any food. We had a quick back and forth, and then we figured out that the delivery was for a different address, and he accidentally went to the wrong house. The guy started to apologize, and I told him not to worry. While he was apologizing, I noticed that his car was filled with 3 other people, 2 in the back and 1 in the passenger seat. I thought that was pretty weird. I never noticed delivery drivers have anyone else in the car with them, let alone an entire carload of people. We finally wrapped up our conversation and locked the door. I made my way back to the living room and tried to get myself comfortable again, and I was a little annoyed, but I understood accidents do happen. Not 2 minutes later, the doorbell starts ringing like crazy. You know that annoying sound of the bell just ringing non-stop? Well, I jumped up and ran to the door. It was the delivery driver, and now he looked a little bit more panicked. I didn't open the front door but shouted through the window beside the door. I asked what he wanted, and he told me that he accidentally hit my car in the driveway while he was trying to leave. And before I could answer, he put his head down and said in an almost ashamed voice, Sorry, man, but it looks like there's a little damage. I hate to bother you, but I think you should take a look. Now I was furious. I opened the front door and started following the delivery driver down the driveway toward my car. I didn't even put shoes on. Several feet from the car, I noticed something strange, though. His car, which was filled with passengers just a few minutes ago, was now empty. I stopped abruptly, and the delivery driver told me to keep going, and that the damage was on the other side of the car. It may have taken a while, but finally I started to get the feeling that something just wasn't right. I told him that I wanted to go back inside and grab my shoes. I started to walk back to the door, trying to pretend that everything was fine, and just a few steps into my walk back, I heard a noise to my right. From the brush on the side of Dom's house, 2 people emerged wearing hoods. I started to jog towards the front door. On the other side of the house, another person started to run full pelt at me, and at that point I began sprinting toward the door. I was inches from the house, and one of the men tried to tackle me. Thankfully, he was just far enough away that he made contact with my ankle, but it wasn't enough to trip me up. I freaked out, got inside, and locked the door behind me. That tackler was immediately at the front door, banging and trying to open it. I was able to get a glimpse of the man who tried tackling me. He looked like he was tan, a skinny guy with a buzzed hair. He had a scruffy beard and a tattoo of some tiger on his neck. I grabbed my phone and called the police right away. I stared out the window while I was speaking with the dispatcher, and I saw all 4 of them standing near my car. I told dispatch what had happened and gave them a very detailed description of the delivery driver and the tiger tattoo man, and I watched all 4 men get into the car and drive away. I was able to tell the police that it was a red Honda Civic, and the police eventually showed up and took my entire statement. But what's frustrating for me is that even with all the details I gave the police, they never caught any of these dudes. But what's most frustrating is that I have no idea why I was targeted. I didn't recognize these guys, and when I told Dom about the incident, the appearance didn't sound familiar to him either. It's scary what can happen out there in the world when you least expect it.
So my aunts were out of town for a couple of weeks, and they trusted me to be home alone. They didn't have anything to worry about. I'm not the partying type. I just like to go to work at a local store in my hometown, go out to eat, get cleaned up, and go to bed. That was my usual routine. That night I decided to stay in, and I ordered some pizza. I just didn't think that this much trouble could arise from something so mundane as ordering pizza. So I called in my order, and it didn't take very long for them to get to my house. I looked to make sure it was the delivery guy, and I was thankfully correct, though he was kinda creepy. I went out and signed for it. The man looked at me though, and began to ask me some creepy personal questions. Questions like, how old are you? And are you here alone? I used to live around creepy guys like this when I was a child, and I knew how to answer them. I told him to just have a good night. I began to turn around with my order when I heard him say something else. By the way, you look really good in your work uniform. I just pretended to smile, and I walked back into my house. I locked the door, and I had an anxiety attack. I didn't see him for a week after that incident, but when I was walking home, I saw him looking around the store, and I hurried out of there. But he followed me, and he said hi. I smiled and waved at him, then kept walking. Yet he kept following me, so I kept looking behind, keeping an eye on him. I walked into a gas station that I always stopped in after work. The manager there knew me very well. I told him the situation, and he told the man to leave me alone before we had a problem. But the manager of the gas station told me what the guy had said back to him, and that's the scariest part. The guy just smiled before walking away. He said, nothing to worry about. I'll have her alone soon. Luckily, nothing more has happened since then, but I have my guard up, ready for anything. At least, I hope I'm ready. I'm a 20-something guy living in the middle of Tennessee. Before this bizarre experience, I'd been going to college full-time to be a paralegal. One day, though, my mother broke her hip after falling down the stairs. She was 52 at the time, and my dad had passed a long time ago, so it was on me to take care of her. We didn't really have anyone else. I was forced to make myself a part-time student because I would have to get a job to help her afford some of her medical bills. At the time, thanks to my late dad, I had a fairly new car, and I figured it'd be fun and easy to deliver pizza. I loved to drive. Where I lived, there was a lot of scenery, and sometimes I even went on drives just for the sake of it. As you can probably guess, it was easy to get the job. I just applied at a few local places and called each of them the next day. Before I knew it, I was delivering pizzas wearing a Domino's hat. Delivering pizza wasn't hard. I can be completely honest with you about that. But delivering can be insanely stressful. You've got to get there at a reasonable time. You keep hoping that the order was made correctly, because you can't just send it back to the kitchen when you're miles away from the restaurant. And last but not least, you find yourself praying that your next customer isn't a prank or a complete jerk. I can't tell you how many jerks I've delivered to. Jerks who didn't want to pay because I wasn't able to give them one more pack of Parmesan cheese. Well, there came a day when I had to deliver a large pizza to an address I did not recognize. The place was about 10 miles away from the restaurant in an area we all infamously called the Boondocks. It was an area that I'd personally never been to, but when I saw it on my drive, I would describe it as a country region of town where there's only a single trashy house every 5 minutes on the road. And I'm not trying to be rude. These places looked beat up, old, and ransacked. It was honestly hard to believe that people still lived in those places. I was fully expecting at any moment to witness a drug deal, or to have someone step out in front of my car to stop me and try to sell me meth. Needless to say, it was a bit of a creepy place. Given that it was getting dark out fast, I was ready to get the delivery over with. I arrived at the customer's address rather quickly, thank God. Luckily, this house was far cleaner than all the ones previous. It was a small white home with a short paved driveway and a seemingly untouched screen door in the front. The yard was well kept and clean, and the grass looked to have been cut recently. Also, there were no cars in the driveway, but I still assumed someone was home to pick up the order. I got out hesitantly and I grabbed the pizza. The carrier was still hot enough to burn my skin if I held it in one spot for too long. This was good. It was probably our most common complaint we got, that our pizzas were too cold or not hot enough when we dropped them off. So that was one thing I didn't have to worry about. With some flimsy confidence, I began to walk up to the screen door. When I was nearly at the porch, I could now see a faint light through the front window, and that's when I saw the silhouette of someone looking out at me. Someone standing there, watching me walk up to their door. Good, I thought. This will be quick. I made it to the front door, cleared my throat for whatever reason, opened the screen door, then knocked on the wooden door. With the first knock, the door slid open. The door hadn't been closed at all, so when I knocked, it opened further. But I swear, there's no way it should have opened that much from a single light knock, because the door, in a matter of seconds, was wide open. I could now see inside. I could see the faint lighting from what appeared to be 2 dim lamps in the living room. I could also see a small, maybe 28-inch TV in the living room, displaying a silent, flat blue screen. For several seconds, I didn't realize that I was holding my breath. I could feel goosebumps coming up on my forearms. What in the world was going on here? Hello? I said. It definitely wasn't loud enough to get anyone's attention though, so instead, without stepping through the doorway, I knocked on the open door, hoping to let someone know that I was here. I waited for at least 2 minutes, but I didn't hear a soul. Nobody walking or talking in the house. No sign that anyone lived there. I stood there, frozen and silent, trying to listen. "Behind you," a voice whispered. I felt breath on the back of my neck, cold, chilling breath. Immediately I spun around. I did it so quickly that I dropped the pizza inside its carrier, but I didn't care. I ran back to my car and was ready to peel out of there, but I made the mistake of looking back at that dang house. I saw it in the window, the silhouette of a person standing there, still watching me. Except now, they were waving. I hauled tail out of there. When I made it back to the restaurant, I was written up for failure to deliver and for losing my pizza carrier. I thought I was going to be fired, to be honest with you, but I think my manager just went easy on me, as she knew the situation with my mother. On one of my rare days off, one of the days I didn't have to work or take care of my mom or go to school, I went back to that strange neighborhood. I found that house again, but it took me a while to be sure that the place I was looking at was really the same place. Because even though it had been about 2 weeks since the incident, the place was a wreck. The screen door was hanging off of its hinges with holes in the screen. The white paint on the outside was now an off-white or nearly yellow, with patches of chipped paint, and the lawn was now a jungle with random auto parts scattered about. I gathered my courage and drove back to the nearest neighbor I could find. I knocked on their door and excused my intrusion. Then I asked them if they knew anything about the strange house. To my surprise, they did. The house was the home of an old man who struggled with his drinking. Apparently, he drove his kids away from frequent abuse, and once those kids left his life for good, he took a shotgun and ended his own life. I was covered with chills as I listened to the story. It was like some sort of ghost story you'd see on TV or hear from an urban legend, but this was real. I'd lived through it. After the man told me that that house hadn't had electricity on for the past year, I thanked him for the information and I bid him good day. I stopped delivering for Domino's after that. I didn't feel like delivering to any more strange places, and I got a better job offer as a manager at a local Subway. Still, sometimes I get a chill on the back of my neck, and I can't help but think about that voice saying, "Behind you."
I'll be the first to admit that I used to be a major asshole. I used to make a living as an armed robber. No joke. And I was mostly targeting big chains with cash that was on site. This is sort of a confession. Their employees never gave a crap to really do anything, whereas you rob a mom and pop shop and you tend to get less mom and more pop, 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 if you know what I mean. I'm trying to make light of it, but either way, I robbed places because I was addicted to heroin. I did just about anything and everything I could get my hands on, but my main thing was H, and to get it, I had to roll with some pretty terrible people. It wasn't so bad if I was around my home turf. I knew the right places to go and the right people to talk to. But whenever I was off on business, which tended to be frequent as you don't want to poop where you eat, as they say, I had to attach myself to certain other folks if I wanted to get what I needed. And I mean it, man. I rolled with some very scary dudes back in the day, but none as scary as Tyran and Lash DeFore. The one and only time I met one of them was when I was down in Georgia, running drugs for some biker gang down there. The DeFores used to make this really killer meth, military grade shit, but they only ever sold in bulk from this compound that they had out in the sticks, and they only ever met you in this one place, away from their cookhouse so no one could find it. It was hard to get a hold of them, even harder to put an order in for a shipment, as they usually sold everything to this group of guys down in Florida to keep their profile low. But this one time, I get told to drive out to that drop site and wait until either Tyran or Lash showed up with the shipment. And so, I drive out to the place, wait there a while, and then this big shirtless dude comes walking out of the woods carrying a backpack. The dude is covered in tattoos with what looked like a really bad hair dye job, but what I later learned was the fumes from him cooking so much bleaching his hair. Anyway, he walks up, looking like I'm something that he found on his shoe, and we make the exchange before he starts asking about people that I'd never even heard of. And the dude was completely whacked out on something, because he kept staring at me in confusion whenever I'd say, "Dude, I don't know who you're talking about here, sorry." He seemed mad at first, like I was lying to him or something, but then on his last name he just started laughing as if to be like, "Whatever, dude." And after that he walked off back into the woods to wherever the hell his compound was, and I drove back to the shop to drop the shipment and collect my payment. A couple of hours later, I'm linking up with a buddy of mine to score some H when I start telling him about the creepy spacey dude that I met out in the woods. The second I get to telling him about this guy's tattoos, he starts asking if I knew the guy's name. Then when I told him it was either Tyran or Lash, he starts making faces as if to say, "Hot damn, you just walked into the lion's den and only got out again by the grace of God." And my buddy then goes about telling me about everything he knows about the Dufour brothers, and everything he'd heard anyway. So these Dufour brothers lived out there in the woods in some hidden compound that they'd built with their own hands, completely off the grid. It was just a lab, cookhouse at first, and all the necessary equipment, but I guess they got sick of driving to and from all the time, and decided to just live out there full time so they could work whatever they wanted to, day or not, without any interruptions whatsoever. And according to the guy I hooked up afterwards to score some H with, the way the Dufour brothers guaranteed no interruptions was to booby-trap the surrounding area with the kinds of stuff that you only see in Vietnam movies. Spike pits, swing and trigger traps, and they even had tripwire grenades strung up in the trees where only Lash or Tyran could see them. I was told that every so often a deer would trigger one of the traps, and that mostly that's how they got their food. But to keep the people at bay, the Dufours had to get a little more creative. The devil traps, I heard them called bird traps too, they look like those little stickmen things from the Blair Witch movie. I don't know how creepy people would find them these days, that movie's 25 years old now, but they sure would have worked on anyone who'd seen that movie. I remember listening to all that and thinking, sure, they sound dangerous, but at least they just want to be left alone. Well, the Dufour brothers did want to be left alone, but only during working hours. The trouble was, they weren't exactly the men-about-town types. Both had multiple warrants, so they couldn't exactly stroll into town for a few cocktails without cops throwing their butts in jail. So instead of going to the party, the Dufours brought the party to them. And they were swimming in cash. Crystal, they sold LSD, so they used to get a whole bunch of girls out there to spend a few days with them whenever they wanted to party. Professionals, you know what I'm saying? They were there to smoke bowls and get paid, but they always got way, way more than they bargained for. No girl ever went twice. They wouldn't. They had to get these new girls in, ignorant ones, or ones who knew that they could spend a few days getting high as a kite, if they could only put up with Tyran and Lash's proclivities, I'll just say. My buddy said that he didn't know exactly what they used to get up to, but that he had heard from one girl that the Dufour brothers liked scaring girls that they had delivered to them. They used to dose them up with a bunch of drugs, and then do all kinds of things to them, try to make them lose their minds. I heard some really weren't ever the same again, and that some of them disappeared afterwards, wanting to get as far away from the Dufour brothers as possible. I heard they were into some weird religious stuff out there too. Something like Santeria, but probably a lot more like devil worship by the sounds of it. Supposedly, Lash and Tyran used to get high as hell, light fires, cut the heads off of animals they trapped, and then drink the blood in these messed up, meth-fueled ritual-type binges. They had all kinds of old books lying around on witchcraft and Satanism and how you can, open up portals with your mind if you think on it real hard. All kinds of crazy crap like that. I think Lash had all sorts of devil tattoos too. Like it wasn't just a style thing for him. They really believed it. I mean, they always said those boys were crazy, and with all the drugs and crystal meth out there, I can believe they smoked themselves onto another friggin' planet. Another time, someone had to go back to their compound for some reason, and after avoiding all the booby traps and all of that, they found Lash Dufour had a friend with him. Whoever it was hadn't seen this new friend around before, which was weird because it was usually only people they really trusted that ever saw the compound, and he'd been working with them for a year by then, so that was to be expected. But then, to see this young-looking kid, maybe 19 or 20, sitting there all whacked out looking like he was having a bad trip, that gave our visitor all kinds of bad vibes, especially when he saw how Lash was messing with him. The kid didn't seem like he was having fun at all, and he even got up and tried to get away. Lash just started laughing, tripped the kid up, and then threw him back on their outdoor couch before telling him to stay put. Lash was always messing with people like that, I mean. He loved doing it with hookers, and he'd do it with his friends too. And the only thing was, the kid's face was on the news for weeks afterwards. He went missing, and never showed up again. Then there was this one time these two guys tried screwing the Dufour brothers over, very sly too, slipping them a few fake bills into a stack. Anyway, it didn't slip by them, but instead of going after him and taking what was theirs up front, the Dufour brothers pretended not to notice. They went along with it, really made the guys that they were selling to, making them think that they were idiots. And then one day, the boys invite their business partners over for a few drinks and no one ever sees them again. I heard Tyran still talks about their skulls, like he gets all messed up on whatever they got over there and then just stares at them, laughing sometimes like they're telling him jokes that no one else can hear. After my buddy finishes telling me about the Dufour brothers, I think about every hair on my body was stood up on end, knowing I'd avoided a similar fate to some of the other poor folks that had made it out near their compound. Made me real glad that I only ever had to deal with them that one time, because get on those boys' bad side and I don't think I'd ever gone anywhere near the state of Georgia ever again. There's some real psychos out there in the world, and the less time you spend around them, the better. I grew up in this one-horse town out in Kansas. My parents owned a small general store but still struggled to make ends meet. Whenever I wasn't at school or playing over at a friend's house, I used to hang out at the store and do odd jobs for my parents. Nothing that'd break any child labor laws, just odds and ends to keep me occupied. One day I remember this guy turning up to the store, kind of weird looking, and the way he looked at me made me not want to be around him. He'd stop by every so often, and whenever he did, I always tried to stay away from him. But this one time, while he was browsing, my dad stepped into the back, and I was alone with the creepy customer for a minute or two. I remember walking to another aisle which towered over me at that age and trying to stay out of that guy's sight, but I remember standing there, then seeing him lean around the corner of the shelf, like one of those velociraptors in Jurassic Park with that big smile on his face. I think I was too nervous to just run off, or maybe just not quite scared enough. But I remember standing there, trying not to look at him, and he came closer and kneeled down beside me. When he said hello, I had no choice but to look at him. I remember thinking that he was going to ask my name and really not wanting to tell him. But instead of asking me anything, he just told me how special I was. It was super weird, because I remember going from thinking that he was a creep to thinking, maybe this guy isn't so bad after all. But then, what he said next I just found confusing. He told me, "Little ladies like you are the most precious thing in the whole wide world," he said. "And the key to everything is right inside here." And as he said that last part, he poked my tummy, soft, with one finger. I wasn't scared, I was just confused. He obviously didn't mean any harm, but at the same time, I knew he was still a stranger and not to be trusted. The guy paid for his stuff and left, and I waited until he was out of earshot before telling my dad about what the man had said and done. I was also confused as to why my dad seemed so angry, and it was Mom who had to explain that it wasn't okay for any stranger to touch me anywhere for any reason at all. They told me that I did the right thing, and apparently the guy came back a few days later only for my dad to chase him out of the store and tell him to never come back. A few years go by and I was still too young to really remember this, but Mom and Dad said that one day the creepy guy's face was all over the papers after state troopers had raided the house that he lived in out in the middle of nowhere. He was living out in some old house with no electricity, no running water, basically living like some doomsday prepper completely detached from society. And with him were a bunch of female relatives, ones that he was inbreeding with. I think they must have rescued about half a dozen of those girls, most of them products of incest, and even though it was a huge story, my parents managed to keep me pretty sheltered from it until I ended up finding out on my own. I was much older then, but it wasn't much easier to take, realizing what the guy meant when he said, "The key to everything is right inside here." And it makes me sick to my stomach that people like that are just existing out there like they do. And it makes me feel even sicker that I had one of them lay his dirty, rotten finger right on me. I suppose he thought that he was letting me in on a little wisdom of his, when really, he was showing me what a sick, evil bastard he was deep down.
This happened when I was 12 years old at an all-boys sleepaway camp in 2010. It was nicknamed Camp Boone in the Carolinas and was a one-week camp for kids who were mainly into the outdoors. It's a really nice camp in the middle of the woods with lots of streams, hiking trails, and even a big lake. It wasn't exactly Boy Scouts or anything, but just the sheer desire for kids my age to have a good summer. We do have to watch out for bears, black panthers, and even black widows, which were all native to North Carolina. The first day we had gotten there, our camp counselor had told us to unpack our belongings and to put them in our assigned cabins. We'd be staying in these small cabins appropriate for about 4 campers. The first few days went pretty well for the most part, with us doing several activities around the camp. These activities usually ranged anywhere from archery to whitewater rafting. However, it was that Thursday night where things took an unexpected turn. It was around 6 p.m. and our group had just finished eating at the dining hall in the lodge. After we had eaten, our camp counselors had gathered our group to go roast marshmallows by the fire pit. Now, the way that this fire pit is set up is that it's located a little ways away from the camp in the woods. Basically, you had to go through this trail that led into a large clearing, and in the center of that was the fire pit. In other words, it was surrounded by a bunch of trees which could easily catch on fire. We all sat down on the provided chairs around the campfire where we had begun sharing stories and making s'mores. Anyway, it's around 9 p.m. at night, and one of the counselors was telling us a story about his scary experience working the night shift. As he's about halfway through the story, our whole group suddenly hears what sounded like a large branch snap from somewhere in the woods. Everyone immediately goes quiet, as if a switch were turned off. Keep in mind that we were quite a ways away from the campsite, which meant that we were in bear territory, which we thought what made the sound. The counselors look at each other with these concerned faces and proceed to take out their bear spray. Almost instantly, we were told to pack up and get back on the trail immediately. We pack up our things, put out the fire, and shined our flashlights to light the way. We find the trail, and as we were getting back on it, we hear clear as day a blood-curdling scream behind us. Almost instantly, everyone comes to a complete stop, and we shine our flashlights by a few trees where we heard it. I'm not sure what it was, but something about the scream really unsettled me. It almost didn't sound human. One of our senior counselors tells us to run and to not look back while he radioed security of the camp. As we were running, the scream was heard again, this time a lot louder, indicating that whatever this was following us. We run for a good few minutes with some of the younger campers nearly crying before we got back to camp. Waiting for us at the lodge was a pair of rangers who had questioned our counselors while we stayed indoors. Rangers and the SOC had went to the area where we had heard the screams but were unable to find anything. This meant that whoever or whatever it was never followed us out of those woods. For those of you who don't know what the SOC is, it's basically the Police of the Woods, which stands for the Summit Operations Center. They basically get dispatched for situations if someone goes missing, a threat to the camp, or any natural hazards. I remember us having to cut the trip early that night, with a bus coming to pick us up in the morning. Our parents were obviously informed about what had happened, with some even pulling their children out of the camp program. It was a sad turnout, but at the end of the day, I could understand why they chose to. I stuck around with that summer camp for a couple more years before finally leaving once I got into my high school years. What was once a nice summer camp full of awesome activities, only to be turned into something much more upsetting. Up until now, that day still brings back those memories of what happened. I have a few theories as to what actually happened that night, but they're too complicated to explain. This just goes to show you that nothing good happens in the woods. This happened back in 2006 at a sleepaway camp in rural Georgia. I was around 13 years old, and it was the midsummer, meaning no school for a whole 3 months. I'd always go to sleepaway camp every summer, and it was a pretty good experience if you wanted to get out more. It was a 5-week trip, and for the first 2 weeks, things went pretty well with tons of activities us young teens would be into. One night, one of our head counselors had told us that we'd be doing an optional early morning activity. It was an annual ritual the campers did called the Polar Bear Ice Challenge. Basically, how it worked was one of the counselors would throw in a watermelon at the bottom of a lake, and the first person to find and grab it won a prize. However, the only hazard was that the water was extremely cold, even during the summer. It was a meaningless activity, but we enjoyed doing it. The next morning at around 6 a.m., the campers who had volunteered woke up and 2 of our counselors led us to the lake. The counselors lined us up on the dock and explained the rules. No teaming, no horseplaying, no fighting, etc. That being said, he grabbed the watermelon, threw it into the lake, and blew the whistle. We all dive in and were met with the extreme coldness that almost caused us to get out. I tried diving back into the water to try and feel for the melon when something grabs my foot and starts pulling. Figuring it was another camper, I tried resisting to make him let go. It was then when I realized that whatever was pulling me didn't feel like a hand. It felt so abnormal, I couldn't see what it was. After what seemed like forever, I managed to go to the surface where I could see all of the scouts on the bank looking at me. One of the counselors immediately realizes as to what's happening and dives in and manages to make whatever was drowning me let go. He pulls me to shore and everyone is questioning me, but all I could tell them was that something had pulled me. The two counselors look at me and my ankle is bright red. We go back to camp where my parents and a health assistant were called. The staff at the camp had dismissed the redness as a rash, but none of us bought it. I haven't been back to that site since, and I'm not sure if I ever will. I still don't know what it was that grabbed me, but I sure as hell don't want to find out. It wasn't until a couple of years later where I had brought it up over dinner with my family. My mom and dad looked at me wide-eyed and told me something I didn't know. As it turns out, there was someone who had lived nearby and went into the lake trying to mess with people. He did this by using a metal wire, which is why my ankle was red. That whole campground closed down because of it and was unable to reopen until the investigation was over. She says I should be very grateful we weren't in that water for too long, as it could have been a whole lot worse. That was the scariest thing that's ever occurred in my life.
It was 2019. I lived in a house with two other girls. We were all in our early 20s. The house backed into a park. It was more like an open lot that was accessible through a main road. There wasn't any playground or barbecue area there, just long thick grass and trees. The backyard fence was only about waist high, and there was a tree on the right-hand side, obstructing about half of the view over the fence into the park. One night after I showered and got into my underwear and a baggy shirt, because it was summer, I hear the dog in the backyard going absolutely mad. My housemate was not home at the time, and the dog belonged to her. I fly out of the back door and see that he's baring his teeth and snarling toward the fence. He had caught and killed possums before, so I was concerned that there was one by the tree. I grabbed him by the collar to get him back inside and away from the possum. As I did, I got a shiver and a sense that something wasn't right. He was still going ballistic, and I looked up and saw a figure standing in the dark just on the other side of the fence. It was a man who was about 5'10", and he didn't say anything. I couldn't see his face. I naturally jump and say, "Oh my goodness, I didn't even see you there." The man did not reply. He just stood there in his beanie and jacket, staring at me. I kept the dog in front of me as I backed into the house. Once inside, I locked up everything and closed all the windows, and I called my partner to come over. A few small things happened over the next few months, but nothing that really stood out. There was a popped security screen, and we found some computer parts in the lawn that could have been discarded by kids or something. One night, I get home after having drinks and dinner with some friends. It was late, around 10 p.m. We often left the back door open to let the dog come in and out. We always just kind of assumed that the dog would scare away anyone from breaking in. How naive. When I got into the kitchen, which was next to the back door, I hear the dog barking in the backyard. Again, this has happened many times before, so I ignore it and make myself a drink before going out there and bringing him back inside. I then see a shadow move to my right, inside the f***ing house, rounding the corner from the back door into the kitchen. I froze. I then think to myself, what on earth is this man doing? It's summer, and he's in a long coat covering his entire neck to his wrists. And then panic set in. I backed myself up to the counter and looked down to see that there was a knife in his hand. It was one of our kitchen knives from the block behind me. So now I'm aware he has already been inside this house. This wasn't a robbery. He had already had the chance to steal anything he wanted. There was a scuffle, and he pulled the rug from under my feet, and I hit my head on the counter. I was knocked unconscious. The last thing I remember is the dog barking from behind him. It turns out our scary dog was too afraid to attack him, but he was still doing his best to scare him away. The police and detectives eventually came, but there wasn't anything that they could do, because technically there was no breaking and entering, since our back door was left wide open. This also meant that it would be difficult to determine what he touched. I also seem to remember that he was wearing gloves, but I'm not 100% sure about that. I did have defensive wounds to my hands, and some bruising, but overall I was fine. It could have been a lot worse. Nothing ever came of this. The police suggested that we lock our back door from now on, and hope nothing like this would ever happen again. I can't be sure if it was the man I saw by our back fence. Around this time we had a third housemate. One day she asked me for a cigarette because she was stressed out about something. I told her that I didn't smoke, and then she suggested that it must be our other housemate. Confused, I said, "What are you talking about? Neither of us smoke." Apparently she had been picking up cigarette butts from outside the front and side doors of our house for her entire stay. She never said anything about it because she decided it was something that bothered her, but clearly not us, so she didn't mind cleaning them up. She would leave very early in the morning for work, before either of us woke up, which is why we never saw them. This is going to be kind of long, so please bear with me. So this happened when I was in high school, and still living with my parents and my younger brother in a house in the suburbs. The area I grew up in was very quiet and safe. We lived in the Midwest, and our town was as Midwest as you can get, which means that everyone knew each other. Even the strangers were very kind and eager to help, with some exceptions, of course. Our neighborhood was the kind of place where every third house had the same exact layout, which means everyone was pretty much living on an equal level. For the most part, everyone got along pretty well, and there was hardly any crime since everyone was coming from a similar financial background. So it would be an understatement to say that it felt very safe where I lived. That was until strange things began to happen. At first, it was small things, pretty inconsequential in the moment, but now when I look back at everything, I always made a connection to the strange events that were going on. It started at the beginning of my junior year of high school. One morning I woke up early to put away my clothes. Because I'm weird about these kind of things, I make sure all my dressers and doors were closed before I left, as I was the last one out of the house, and I happened to have a doctor's appointment on that day. I was the first one back. When I came up to my room, my door wasn't closed all the way, and my closet was completely open. I thought it was weird, but I brushed it off. But this happened more than once. I would sometimes be missing shirts or pants after I told myself that I was just being stupid and probably misplaced them somewhere. Another night, after I had gone to bed, I was woken up by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. The fifth step always creaked very loudly. And when I heard that, I instantly sat up. I remember it clearly because I could hear it over my fan. After the footsteps stopped, I checked every room upstairs. All of the bedrooms were on the second floor. All the doors were closed and everyone else was sleeping. All of the doors creak pretty loudly when they're opened in the night, so I would have heard something since I was the only one who slept with their door open. I couldn't see much. Everyone was sound asleep. I stayed awake for a while to try to catch it again, but I eventually fell asleep, figuring that my mind was just playing tricks on me. I asked my family about it casually the next morning, but everyone said they slept through the night. All of these small occurrences accumulated into one of the weirdest experiences I've had to date. It was halfway through the year, and I had driven myself and my brother home from high school. I threw down my bags on the dining room table and laid down on the couch to watch some TV. My brother went downstairs to take the dog out and then play some video games. I could tell by the fact that there were no other cars in the garage that my parents were still at work. So I put the volume on medium so I could hear them when they got back. My parents used to give me a lot of crap for watching TV after school. Everything was fine, and I actually began dozing off when I heard a very distinct thumping sound coming from upstairs. I thought it was just my imagination. I watch a lot of horror films, so I tend to be pretty jumpy sometimes. I went back to my show, but the thumping continued for about 5 minutes. That's when I finally decided that something was off. I muted the TV and listened for a few more minutes. It was a rhythmic thumping, and it was coming from directly upstairs. For a second, I thought it was just my dog, since he sometimes paced up and down the stairs, trying to find somewhere to lay down. So I called out for him, but my brother shouted that he was downstairs with him. So I walked up the stairs to the top and listened. The noise was coming from directly above me. I started to get scared when I realized that the only thing above me was the attic. And furthermore, I realized that it wasn't thumping that I was hearing. It was footsteps, like somebody was wearing boots and pacing around the attic. Even though I was thinking the worst, I told myself to be practical. There are only 2 entrances to the attic, a small panel in the ceiling of my brother's bedroom, and a 3rd-story window. I checked his bedroom, and the panel looked like it hadn't been touched in a very long time. We hadn't even opened it since we moved in, because the previous owners told us it was just insulation and wiring. I then thought about how we were having trouble recently with our satellite dish, and my dad had to call a repairman to come fix it. I opened the front door and went around back, but there wasn't anything on the roof, not that I could see anyway. It was pretty high up. I then went back inside. My brother was standing in the doorway, asking me what was going on, since he heard the door open. I told him about what I heard and asked him to come check it out with me, just to make sure I wasn't going crazy. When we got upstairs, he gets this weird look on his face and then asked, "What is that?" I felt relieved knowing it wasn't just me. I whispered, "It sounds like somebody is walking up there, right?" He nods and points downstairs, suggesting that we say no more and I should follow him down there. The floors are pretty thin in this house, so in case there was somebody up there, we would want to talk about this out of earshot. Once we were downstairs, I tell him about the roof and the possibility of a repairman being up there, although I didn't see a van outside, and my brother shakes his head, saying that the repair people were coming later that week. That's when we decided to call our dad. I explained everything to him. I could tell that he didn't believe us, but was trying to be nice about it. I can't exactly blame him. It was highly improbable for somebody to even want to be in our attic, let alone get up there. He suggested it might have been a bird or a raccoon. We lived near a large patch of woods. I tried explaining to him that no animal could make that kind of thumping sound. If it was a bird, it would have had to have been repeatedly slamming itself into the floor. And even then, that wouldn't explain how the floor was creaking like somebody was shifting their weight. He said just to wait it out and that he would be home soon. The thumping continued for well over 30 minutes. I decided to camp out in my brother's room until it stopped. After about 15 minutes, I had to use the restroom. There's one right next to his room and is still under the attic. As I was washing my hands, I realized that the thumping was a lot louder now and directly above me. It was weird because before, the thumping was loud when I was in my brother's room. It was like the sound had followed me. Sometimes when I get really scared, I get super angry. So I banged twice on the ceiling. I'm a pretty tall girl, so I used my fist. I then shouted, "What the f*** is this?" The steps then completely stopped. I was confused for a second. Then clear as day, there were two loud thuds. Like someone stomping their foot twice very loud. I ran out of the bathroom to my brother, who was coming up the stairs. "What just happened?" The pacing started again, so I quickly explained everything to my brother. He then pulled out his phone and called my dad a second time. As he's trying to explain everything, I can tell that my dad is still not giving in, frustrated and frightened. I take the phone from my brother, put my dad on speaker, and hold the phone up to the attic, then say, "Listen to this." Suddenly, all the noises completely stop. Absolutely no sound whatsoever. After about a minute of silence, I hear my dad say, "What sound?" My brother and I just look at each other and bolt down the stairs. I tell my dad to come home quick and that we would wait downstairs for him. He then said that he was pulling up the driveway, so we opened the door and ran out to him. After my brother and I explained things quickly and nearly out of breath, to my dad's credit, we did sound a bit insane. He follows us upstairs to where the sound was coming from. But now, there was absolutely no sound at all. And even though we beg him several times to go take a look, he laughs and says that we're just overreacting, and there was nothing there. Taking out the panel might cause some damage to the ceiling. We don't know that for sure because we've never tried to look up there, so he was pretty set on not going up there to check things out, unless he hears it himself. Of course, the steps never came back, at least not when we were around or awake. My brother secretly stayed in my room for a couple of days, because he was still freaked out about the whole thing, and we were never able to prove what happened to our parents. When the repair people finally did come, I noticed that instead of using a ladder, they went around to our backyard and climbed up to the roof from our deck. They were also able to walk around pretty freely up there and could easily access the window to our attic, which was around the front of the house. I've always wondered if there was someone secretly living up there and would come down at night without us knowing. But if that was the case, why would they let us know that they were up there that day? It still bothers me that we never checked. My name is Caleb Fletcher. I'm 16 years old, and the story that I'm about to tell is something that I'll never forget. This took place on the 24th of August. School had been going on for about 2 weeks. So to decompress, I decided to see if my friends Griffin and Broly wanted to hop on Fortnite. My mom and sister were out shopping, and my dad was working, so I was pretty bored. It was around 8 p.m. when we finally got online to play. After a few rounds, I could tell that my friends were getting tired of losing, so they logged off after about an hour. I planned on just lying down with my phone before going to bed. That was until I heard my 2 dogs barking outside. It's not that unusual for them to bark, given how people walk on the side of the road outside of our front yard. But I still looked anyway. You can never be too careful these days. I didn't see anyone there, but seconds after I looked out of the window, I heard our garage door opening and then closing. That usually meant my dad was home from work. However, I thought it was odd that I didn't see his van outside, and he had even texted me earlier, letting me know that he would be working late. I decided to walk downstairs into the dining room to get a better look. From there, I could see that the driveway was empty. At first I thought, oh shit, could it be a ghost? For context, someone had died on our property many years ago when there used to be a gas station here. Apparently an old man put too much air into his tire and it exploded. Now, I'm not the type to go investigate strange noises in the night, so I ran back up to my bedroom and texted my family group chat to ask if anybody was home. I told my mom about the garage door, and she told me to turn off all the lights, lock my bedroom door, and stay in there until she got home. So I did just that. About 15 minutes later, I thought I heard the wooden floorboards downstairs creaking, like somebody was trying to sneak around. I didn't have anything to use as a weapon, so I unclipped my microphone's boom arm from my desk and quietly opened my door. I walked onto the upstairs balcony and looked over, trying to see if I could spot anyone hiding or anything suspicious. I then stupidly called out, "Is anyone there?" As if somebody was actually going to answer me. For a second, I thought I was just being paranoid about this whole thing, until I saw the silhouette of someone standing beneath the balcony. I panicked and ran to the closest room, which happened to be the small bathroom beside my room. The intruder must have known that I saw him, because I heard loud footsteps coming up our stairs as I locked myself inside. I was cursing under my breath that I had accidentally left my phone in my bedroom. After hearing nothing for several minutes, I finally built up enough courage and bolted out of the bathroom into my bedroom, locking the door as soon as I got in. My sister's room was right across from mine, and I noticed that her door was open, so I figured that's where the intruder must have gone. After locking myself in my bedroom, I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. But just before I hit the call button, I noticed that the door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I then saw an eyeball peeking through the crevice. That's when it hit me. The intruder was not in my sister's room. He was here, with me. The terror I felt rushing through my body is something that I will never forget. True, genuine fear. I ran out of the bedroom and booked it down the stairs and out my front door. I then ran up the hill to my neighbor's house, who happened to be a police officer. I told him about the intruder hiding in my bedroom, and he immediately alerted the police. Then he set out to go investigate himself, while I stayed behind with his wife. Minutes later, I ran back down to see if the intruder had been caught. When I entered my house, I saw a tall, skinny man I had never seen before. He had a gray beard and a dirty black coat. He was on the ground, being handcuffed by my neighbor. Ever since that night, I'm no longer allowed to be home alone anymore, and we have upgraded our security around the house now. My family is just happy that I wasn't hurt and are very thankful for my neighbor's bravery. I don't wish an experience like this on anyone, not even my worst enemy.
My name is Jim, and I've spent a lot, and I mean a lot, of time on the road as a trucker. Ever since trucking school, I've been driving long distances for hours every day, and even with benefits, the pay wasn't the best. While it did pay enough to financially support me and my wife, the stress it had on top of me was unbearable. Being in a truck for hours at a time really forced you to make sacrifices. Once in a while, I'd miss out on family events like birthdays and even holidays, which didn't feel good at all. On top of that, America is in desperate need for truckers to keep up with demand, which made the situation even worse. I drive for about 12 hours a day, and we couldn't stop for any reason until we reached our destination. Needless to say, I barely had any time with family. One night, I was doing my nightly routine of driving to a warehousing complex to deliver some products for major retail businesses like Target and Best Buy. I was somewhere in a rural area of Wisconsin on this long, empty road that stretched across the state. It's around 6 a.m. and I'm sipping my coffee trying to keep myself awake. Being a full-time trucker, caffeine was your best friend. If you didn't have it, you were in trouble. So there I am, driving down this road trying to keep myself awake when I see something big walk across the road from my headlights. I yell out an "oh shit" while practically slamming my brakes, coming to a complete stop. All the while, I'm cussing to myself, thinking that I just hit a person or possibly a bear. Going back, at first I did think it was a person, but then I remembered that whatever it was massive. 9 feet tall, a bulky body, and the movement it was walking looked abnormal. I step outside of the truck with my gun in hand, going to where I saw it. To my surprise, however, there was seemingly nobody on this road. Nobody walking, no roadkill, no nothing. The only thing I did see was faint tire marks on the road from me hitting the brakes too hard. I call out for anybody who might have been nearby, but got no response other than the sound of wind picking up and the truck engine. I get back inside and continue my route, managing to finish it within a few hours, but couldn't get what I had just seen off my mind. Later that same day, I call up one of my other fellow truckers and tell him about what I had just seen on the road. It turns out that he had experienced things that were similar and that it was likely a hallucination given that I was tired. Thankfully, I have a camera that sits next to the interior and was thankfully able to capture a brief second of this creature before it went out of frame. The photo will be on screen now. As you can see, the camera quality isn't that great, but it was likely due to the condensation on the front windshield. Because it was a single road with forest on opposite sides, there was a pretty good chance that it was an animal. My only question is what kind of animal 9 feet tall walks on 2 legs? I don't know if it was a person, I don't know if it was Bigfoot. One thing I do know was that I wasn't imagining it. My name is Sarah, and this happened to me a few years ago when I was a sophomore in college. I attended school in one of the most quiet and safest cities in the country. The people were nice, the crime was low, and sirens would almost never be heard. Because of this, I never really had any unsettling encounters. However, little did I know, that would all change in just one night. It was late November of 2021, and my friends and I had decided to go out to a bar to celebrate getting through finals. While the city did have low crime, it was also known to have a lot of bars and pubs. This resulted in a lot of bar fights where cops would be called. Anyway, my friends and I are at the bar taking shots and having a blast. The feeling of relief you get when finishing finals was amazing. At around 1 a.m., I told my friends that I had to go as I had to finish packing to fly back home the next day. However, they wanted to stay behind and finish their drinks, so I said my proper goodbyes and stumbled out of the bar. Because I was nearly drunk at this point, I went on my phone and decided to order an Uber back to my dorm. Thankfully, one accepted my ride request almost immediately, which wasn't common seeing that it was late. I sit down on the outside bench when I see a car pull up and someone waving their arm out. Even in my drunken state, I assumed that this had to be my Uber, even though the app showed he was still 4 minutes away. I brushed it off, assuming it was a glitch in the app, and got into the car. The very second I get into the car, I immediately noticed the red flags. For one, he didn't even say my name, and two, he never greeted me. But it was late, and I was simply too tired to care and just told him my address. As I'm in the car, I also noticed that he never put the address into his GPS, which I found odd. Figuring he must have known the area well, I let him do his thing while I just kinda kept to myself. I'd try asking him questions to make small talk, but he'd just reply with one-word answers. It eventually came to a point where I didn't even bother talking to him anymore. At one point, I look out the window and realize he was going in the complete opposite direction of my campus.
Hi sir, my college is in the other direction.
I see him glance at the rearview mirror while giving me a nod as if he had acknowledged or understood me. However, he didn't turn around and just kept driving until he eventually pulled over beside an old office building. That was when I slowly came back to reality and knew what was going on when I start panicking. The fake Uber driver gets out and tells me to stay put while he goes around the building. I have no idea who or what he was going to get, but whatever it was definitely wasn't good. I grab my cell phone and see that I had several missed calls and messages from the real Uber driver. I knew I didn't have a lot of time, so I slowly open the door and start running while trying to keep my balance. There weren't many people in this part of the city, so I ran into a nearby shop that was still open where I called the cops. I'd say within a few minutes, 2 police cruisers pulled up to the office building, but the car that was there was gone. They questioned me and made sure I described the car's description in perfect detail. I'm still unsure if they ever found the car or not, but I'd like to think that they did. A month after this incident, I saw a chilling news report about a couple who had gone missing getting into a car they thought was their Uber. The boyfriend's body was found 20 plus miles away. The girlfriend survived even after suffering from severe bruises. The news said it was someone they apparently knew, but I've always wondered about that. As of now, the car has never officially been found, and the driver has never been identified. For a little bit of context, this happened on July 4th of 2019. I had just started doing both Uber and Lyft as a side hustle to make some extra money for my boyfriend and I. It wasn't the best paying job, but flexibility was through the roof, and you didn't have people telling you what to do. It's a chill and steady job, but you always had to stay on top of what you were doing. Anyway, it was the 4th of July, and I decided to do some Ubering as I knew there would be a lot of people out. Every 4th of July, my city hosts this annual music festival where thousands of people attend, so I was guaranteed to get a few people. Almost immediately, I kept getting requests left and right as people exited the venue. I decided to choose one, and within a few minutes I see a man walk up to my car. He asked if I was his Uber, to which I replied with a yes. He gets in the back seat, and right away, the strong smell of marijuana hit me like a brick. However, I knew that he had just come from the festival where smoking was bound to happen, so I wasn't complaining. Throughout the ride, this guy just stared intently at me, as if he were watching my every move. I'll be honest, it kind of made me uncomfortable, and I just wanted to get this ride over with. At one point, he stops staring at me and gets out his phone to call someone. I just tried to focus on driving, and his destination was only 10 minutes away, which was a relief in my book. As I'm driving, I hear him in the back speaking French. Now, my aunt is French, so while I understand a fair bit of French, I don't speak it. So I hear him talking, but I don't pay attention as it's rude to eavesdrop on people's conversations. That was until he said something along the lines of, "This girl I'm riding with." I felt my blood run cold as he said this, but tried to make it seem like I didn't understand him. What he was saying was unnerving. To sum it all up, he was basically saying after I had dropped him off, he was planning on, quote, snatching me up. I knew exactly what that meant, and his stop was only 5 minutes away, so I didn't have much time. I'm a 5'3" petite girl that weighs about 150 pounds. This guy was at least over 6 feet and was muscular, so there was no way I could resist him even if I tried. With very little time to spare, I get out my phone to call my boyfriend. My actual plan was to cause a scene and make up an excuse to leave. As I'm driving, I call him and ask what was up, where I immediately say, "Wait, what? She's bleeding on the floor? Tell her to stay calm, I'm coming." All the while, my boyfriend is completely confused, asking what I was talking about, etc. Thankfully, I used to be in acting school, so I was used to faking a good scene. At that point, I hung up, turned to the man, and said in a worried tone,
Sir, my grandma just hurt herself. I have to go. I'm just gonna drop you off here.
I floored it down the road before calling my boyfriend back and apologizing, telling him everything. I ended up reporting the man to Uber, but I'm not sure if they investigated it as of yet. Thank you to my boyfriend for picking up, and thank you to my aunt for teaching me French.